The life expectancy was 11 seconds. Not minutes, not hours, 11 seconds, from the moment you started your shift. Tonight, you'll discover which World War II job was so fatal that even hardened veterans would rather face a firing squad. When the world exploded into war in 1939, millions of ordinary people suddenly found themselves doing jobs that didn't exist the day before. Your neighbor who fixed radios, he's now crawling under bomber planes to install gun turrets. The guy who delivered milk, he's learning to read German submarine codes. The woman who taught third grade, she's building aircraft engines in a factory that used to make washing machines. War has this funny way of turning everything upside down overnight. One day you're worried about your mortgage. The next day someone's handing you a uniform and telling you to jump out of a perfectly good airplane. But here's what nobody talks about in those heroic war movies. Most people had absolutely no idea what they were getting into. The government needed bodies, and they needed them fast. Training, well, that was more of a suggestion than a requirement. A typical bomber crew got maybe 6 weeks of preparation before being shipped overseas to face some of the deadliest skies in human history. 6 weeks, that's barely enough time to learn how to parallel park, let alone survive aerial combat against experienced enemy pilots. Then there's the technology factor that nobody saw coming. World War I was still fresh in everyone's memory. Trenches, gas masks, bayonets, but by 1940, warfare had gone completely insane. Radar systems that could spot planes from miles away, anti-aircraft guns that fired shells programmed to explode at specific altitudes, submarines that could stay underwater for weeks, fighter planes that flew faster than cars on a highway. The really twisted part, the jobs that looked safe often turned out to be death traps, while some of the obviously dangerous roles had surprisingly good survival rates. Radio operators seemed harmless enough, just guys with headphones sitting behind desks. Right, wrong. Enemy forces figured out quickly that if you kill the radio guy first, the entire unit goes deaf and blind. Meanwhile, some frontline medics had better survival odds because even enemy soldiers needed medical help and would sometimes hold their fire. But let's talk about the elephant in the room. Nobody volunteered for these jobs knowing the real statistics. The military wasn't exactly publishing mortality rates in the recruitment brochures. When they asked for volunteers to join bomber crews, they didn't mention that some units were losing 80% of their men before completing their required missions. That might have affected the sign-up rate just a little bit. The speed of technological change meant that danger levels shifted constantly. A job that was relatively safe in 1940 could become a nightmare by 1942. Take merchant sailors, for example. Early in the war, crossing the Atlantic was routine cargo work. Then German U-boats started hunting in coordinated packs, and suddenly delivering supplies became more dangerous than frontline infantry duty. Thousands of sailors ended up floating in lifeboats, watching their ships burn on the horizon. What made everything worse was the learning curve. Military leaders were making up tactics as they went along, often using their own soldiers as test subjects. The first paratroop drops were basically experiments with human lives. Nobody really knew if men loaded with 60 pounds of equipment could survive jumping from planes at night into enemy territory. Turns out the answer was sometimes if they're really lucky. The psychological pressure was something else entirely. Unlike civilian jobs where you can quit if things get too dangerous, military service came with a small detail called desertion charges. Leave your post and you might face a firing squad from your own side. So people stuck with jobs that were clearly going to kill them, because the alternative was getting shot for cowardice. And here's the kicker, many of the deadliest jobs went to the youngest recruits. 18-year-old kids who'd never been away from home were suddenly operating complex machinery under combat conditions. Ball turret gunners, the guys who hung in tiny glass bubbles underneath bomber planes, were often chosen specifically because they were small and young. Their job was basically to dangle under the aircraft like human bait while enemy fighters tried to shoot them. The cruel mathematics of warfare meant that certain positions had built-in expiration dates. Everyone knew it, nobody talked about it. Bomber crews would quietly count missions, knowing that statistically, most of them wouldn't make it to their 25th flight. Tank crews understood that their steel coffins attracted every artillery shell within 5 miles. But people kept showing up for these jobs anyway, because somebody had to do them. The war wasn't going to win itself, and every dangerous position served a critical purpose in the larger strategy. Speaking of critical purposes, some of the most lethal jobs were also the most essential, like the men who climbed into those cramped bomber gun positions. knowing that enemy fighters specifically targeted them first. These bomber crews faced odds that would make a casino owner nervous, flying mission after mission into skies filled with everything designed to kill them. When the war machine needed crews for its bombers, millions of young men lined up. They thought flying sounded better than crawling through mud with the infantry. Boy, were they wrong. The statistics tell a brutal story. In the 8th Air Force alone, nearly half of all bomber crews never made it home. That's not 5% or 10%. That's almost every other person who climbed into those flying fortresses. The math was simple and terrifying. Complete 25 missions, and you could go home. But most crews didn't make it past mission number 10. Flying at 25,000 feet over Nazi Germany meant entering a shooting gallery where you were the target. German anti-aircraft guns, called flak, turned the sky black with explosive shells. Each burst sent razor-sharp metal fragments in every direction. One piece the size of your thumb could tear through aluminum like tissue paper. The sound inside those bombers was deafening. Engines roaring, machine guns chattering, and the constant ping-ping-ping of shrapnel hitting the fuselage. Then there were the German fighters. Messerschmitt 109S and Focke-Wulf 190S came screaming out of the sun at 400 miles per hour. They'd learned that head-on attacks worked best against American bombers. Makes sense, right? Hit them before they could bring all their defensive guns to bear. These fighter pilots weren't rookies either. Many had been flying combat missions since 1940, racking up kill after kill. But here's what really got to bomber crews: the cold. At 5 miles high, temperatures dropped to 60 degrees below zero. Oxygen masks froze to faces. Machine gun oil turned solid. Crews wore electrically heated flight suits that barely kept hypothermia at bay. When those suits failed, and they often did, frostbite claimed fingers and toes faster than you could count them. The weird part is how routine it all became. Crews would wake up at 3 a.m., eat powdered eggs and coffee that tasted like motor oil, then sit through briefings that might as well have been death sentences. Mission planners would pull back the curtain on a map, revealing that day's target. If the string stretched deep into Germany, you'd hear grown men groan like they'd been punched in the stomach. Some targets were worse than others. Schweinfurt, where the Germans made ball bearings. Ploesti, surrounded by more anti-aircraft guns than anywhere else on Earth. Berlin, where every fighter in the Luftwaffe seemed to be waiting. Crews kept mental lists of places they hoped never to see again. Most got their wish. They didn't survive the first visit. Aircraft maintenance couldn't keep up with battle damage. Bombers limped back to England with engines smoking, hydraulics shot out, and holes big enough to crawl through. Ground crews worked miracles with sheet metal and prayers, but sometimes the math just didn't work. Too much damage, too little time, too many missions still to fly. The replacement crews kept coming though. Fresh-faced kids from Nebraska and California who'd never seen combat. Veterans could spot them immediately. They were the ones asking questions and checking their parachutes twice. The old-timers, guys who'd survived maybe 15 missions, stopped talking to the new arrivals. Why bother learning names when half would be dead in a week? Letters home became exercises in creative writing. Nobody wanted to tell their mother that yesterday's mission killed 37 bombers and their 10-man crews. Instead, they wrote about English weather and how the food wasn't so bad. The censors cut out anything that might hint at losses or morale problems. What made it through the mail was mostly lies wrapped in hope. Some crews developed rituals that bordered on superstition, lucky charms, specific breakfast routines, particular seats in the briefing room, anything that might tip the odds in their favor, even by the tiniest margin. The smart ones knew these rituals were nonsense, but they followed them anyway. In a world where randomness decided who lived and died, any sense of control felt precious. Medical officers started noticing something they called operational fatigue, what we'd call PTSD today. Hands that wouldn't stop shaking, nightmares that made sleep impossible, men who'd completed 20 missions but couldn't force themselves to climb into another bomber. The Air Force didn't have much patience for this condition. Complete your tour, or face a court-martial for cowardice. Despite everything, these bomber crews kept flying. Day after day, month after month, they climbed into those aluminum coffins and headed for Germany. They knew the statistics. They'd watched friends disappear in balls of fire. They understood that tomorrow might not come. But they went anyway, carrying the war to the enemy's doorstep at altitudes where mistakes meant death and heroism was just another word for survival. Of course, some positions on these bombers were deadlier than others. and nowhere was this more obvious than in the ball turret hanging beneath the aircraft like a glass bubble of vulnerability. If bomber crews had it rough, there was one position that made everyone else grateful for their jobs. The ball turret gunner got the worst spot on any aircraft in World War II. These guys were literally hanging underneath the plane in a tiny glass bubble, watching the ground rush by thousands of feet below them. The ball turret was exactly what it sounds like, a spherical glass and metal cage that could rotate in any direction. Well, almost any direction. The gunner had to curl up inside this thing like he was trying to fit into a washing machine. His knees were practically touching his chin, and he stayed that way for hours at a time. Comfortable, not even close. But comfort wasn't the point. These turrets could shoot in almost every direction to protect the bomber's belly from enemy fighters. Here's where it gets really nasty. The ball turret was completely exposed underneath the aircraft, while other crew members had at least some armor plating around them. Ball turret gunners were sitting ducks in a glass house. Enemy fighters loved targeting them first because they were easy to spot and impossible to miss. The Luftwaffe pilots knew exactly where to aim. The temperature inside that turret was absolutely brutal. At 25,000 feet, the air outside could drop to 50 degrees below zero. The turret had no real heating system, just whatever warmth might drift down from the main aircraft. Frostbite wasn't just possible, it was expected. Gunners regularly lost fingers and toes to the cold. Some guys couldn't feel their hands well enough to operate their guns properly after a few hours in the air. But here's the part that really kept these guys awake at night. If the ball turret's electrical system got damaged, the gunner could be stuck in any position. Sometimes the turret would freeze pointing straight down, leaving the poor guy staring at the ground for the entire flight home. Other times it would jam sideways, and the gunner couldn't get back into the plane even after landing. Ground crews had to manually crank the turret back into position before the gunner could climb out. Speaking of climbing out, that was its own nightmare. The ball turret was so cramped that gunners couldn't wear parachutes inside. Their parachute was stored in the main aircraft, which meant they had to climb back up through the turret's hatch to get it. In an emergency, this process took precious minutes they usually didn't have. If the plane was going down fast, or if the turret was jammed, the gunner was trapped. Many ball turret gunners never made it out of their planes. When bombers got hit and started falling, the ball turret guys were often the first to die and the last to escape. There are stories of B-17 smoking emergency landings with the landing gear damaged, scraping the belly of the plane along the runway. Anyone still in the ball turret didn't survive those landings. The psychological pressure was incredible too. These gunners had the best view of everything happening during an air battle. They could see enemy fighters approaching from below before anyone else. They watched other bombers in their formation get shot down and explode. They saw crew members falling through the air, sometimes with parachutes, sometimes without. The whole war was happening right in front of their eyes, and they couldn't look away. Then there's the practical problem of doing their job while hanging upside down in a tiny space. Ball turret gunners had to track fast-moving enemy fighters while their own plane was bouncing around in turbulence. They had to coordinate with other gunners on the plane using radio systems that barely worked on a good day. And they had to do all this while freezing cold and cramped into an impossible position. The life expectancy of ball turret gunners was measured in missions, not months. Some guys lasted only 2 or 3 flights before getting killed or wounded. The lucky ones made it through 10 missions. Making it through the required 25 missions to complete a tour of duty was almost unheard of for ball turret gunners. Most of these guys were young, 18, 19, maybe 20 years old. They'd volunteered for the Army Air Forces thinking they'd avoid the mud and trenches of ground combat. Instead, they found themselves in what might have been the most dangerous job in the entire war. The Army needed gunners, and somebody had to do it. What made it worse was that everyone knew how dangerous the job was. Other crew members looked at ball turret gunners differently. There was respect there, but also a kind of pity. Everyone understood that the guy in the ball turret probably wasn't coming home. The few who did survive had stories that would make your skin crawl. But even survivors often couldn't walk away from the war completely. The isolation and terror of hanging underneath a bomber while enemy fighters tried to kill you left permanent scars on these guys. Of course, ball turret gunners weren't the only crew members facing death from isolated positions on bombers. There was another spot that was just as dangerous and just as lonely. If you thought being crammed into a ball turret was bad, spare a thought for the tail gunners. These guys sat alone at the very back of the bomber, facing backwards while everyone else looked forward. Talk about having the worst view in the house. The tail gunner's job was simple in theory. Watch for enemy fighters coming from behind and shoot them down before they could attack the bomber. In practice, well, that's where things got messy. Enemy pilots knew exactly where to find the tail gunner, and they made sure to target him first. After all, if you could knock out the guy watching your back, the rest of the bomber became a sitting duck. Picture this setup for a moment. You're squeezed into a tiny glass compartment at the rear of a B-17 flying fortress, surrounded by nothing but thin sheets of metal and hope. The temperature outside is -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're flying at 25,000 feet. Your job is to rotate your twin 50 caliber machine guns and scan the sky behind the bomber for trouble. But here's the thing, when trouble came, it came fast and it came hard. German fighter pilots developed specific tactics for dealing with tail gunners. They'd approach from below and behind, staying in the gunner's blind spots as long as possible. Then they'd pull up suddenly and rake the tail section with machine gun fire. The tail gunner had maybe 3 seconds to spot the threat, swing his guns around, and return fire. 3 seconds. That's barely enough time to say incoming fighter, let alone do anything about it. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. While the rest of the crew could at least see each other and communicate easily, the tail gunner sat alone in his little glass cage. The intercom system worked, most of the time, but engine noise and static made clear communication difficult. During combat, when adrenaline was pumping and everyone was shouting instructions, the tail gunner often couldn't make out what anyone was saying. He had to rely on his eyes and instincts, nothing more. Then there were the technical problems that could turn deadly. The tail gun position was notorious for jamming at the worst possible moments. Spent shell casings would pile up around the gunner's feet, and if the ejection system failed, those hot brass casings could interfere with the gun's rotation mechanism. Imagine trying to swing your guns to track an enemy fighter, and finding them stuck in place. Meanwhile, that German pilot is lining up his shot, and you can't do anything but watch. The physical demands were brutal too. Sitting in that cramped position for 8 or 10 hours during a bombing mission meant constant back pain and leg cramps. But you couldn't just stretch or take a break. Enemy fighters could appear at any moment, and a tail gunner who wasn't ready meant a dead bomber crew. Some gunners developed permanent back problems from the awkward position they had to maintain throughout the mission. Communication breakdowns led to some tragic situations. There are documented cases where tail gunners spotted enemy fighters approaching but couldn't get through to the pilot on the intercom. They'd watch helplessly as German planes positioned themselves for attack runs, frantically trying to radio warnings that no one could hear. By the time the rest of the crew realized what was happening, it was often too late. The survival statistics for tail gunners make for grim reading. In some bomber squadrons, tail gunners had a lower survival rate than even ball turret gunners. They were primary targets, sitting in an exposed position with limited armor protection. When a bomber went down, the tail gunner's chances of getting out were slim. The tail section often broke away from the main fuselage during crashes, and even if the gunner survived the initial impact, he might be trapped in the wreckage. But perhaps the most unnerving aspect was the psychological pressure. Every tail gunner knew that enemy fighters preferred to attack from behind. They knew they were the first line of defense and the primary target. Flying mission after mission with that knowledge took a special kind of courage. Many tail gunners reported having nightmares about enemy fighters that they couldn't see coming, about guns that wouldn't work when they needed them most. The irony is that tail gunners were often the youngest members of the crew, barely out of high school. These kids found themselves responsible for protecting 9 other men, while sitting alone in the most vulnerable position on the aircraft. The mortality rate among these young gunners was staggering, and many bomber crews went through multiple tail gunners during their tour of duty. While tail gunners faced death from behind, another group of airmen took on an entirely different kind of risk. Fighter pilots didn't have the luxury of flying in formation with other crew members for protection. They flew alone, and when enemy planes found them, survival came down to split-second decisions and pure flying skill. Fighter pilots had it rough, but not in the way most people think. Sure, they got the glory shots in the newsreels and the admiring looks from folks back home, but when you're strapped into a Mustang or Spitfire at 20,000 feet, facing down a Messerschmitt that's diving straight at you, glory is the last thing on your mind. You've got maybe 3 seconds to react before someone's going home in a wooden box. The thing about dogfights, they happened fast, brutally fast. 1 minute you're cruising in formation, scanning the horizon for bogeys. The next minute, enemy fighters are screaming down from the sun, and your nice orderly world turns into a spinning, roaring mess of bullets and burning metal. Most aerial combat lasted less than 5 minutes. That's it, 5 minutes to live or die. based on split-second decisions and whether your engine decided to keep running. Here's what the recruiting posters never mentioned. Fighter planes were basically flying gas tanks with wings. One tracer round in the wrong spot, and whoosh, you're riding a fireball. The fuel lines ran right through the cockpit area in many aircraft. Pilots knew this. They'd seen too many friends turn into meteors to forget it. Some carried pistols not for the enemy, but for themselves in case the flames got too close and the canopy wouldn't open. But wait, it gets worse. Training could only do so much. You could be the best pilot in flight school, ace every test, nail every landing. Then you'd meet Hans or Fritz, who'd been flying combat missions since 1939 and had 30 kills painted on his fuselage. Experience trumped training every single time. The Luftwaffe's veteran aces had a nasty habit of singling out the new guys. Fresh pilots were easy to spot. They flew too rigid, too by the book. The experienced German pilots could smell rookie blood from miles away. Flight gear didn't help much either. Early war pilots wore leather jackets that looked cool but offered zero protection from bullets or fire. Later they got flak vests, but those were designed for bomber crews dealing with anti-aircraft shrapnel, not machine gun rounds fired at point-blank range. Your best armor was speed and the ability to jink your aircraft around like a drunken bee. Then there's the mechanical failures. Engines that quit without warning. Guns that jammed when you needed them most. Landing gear that refused to extend, leaving you with the choice of belly landing or bailing out over enemy territory. American P-51 Mustangs were reliable, but even they had quirks. British Spitfires were nimble as cats but thirsty for fuel. German Focke-Wulfs could outrun almost anything but had a tendency to catch fire. Russian Yaks were tough but basic. Some didn't even have radios. Radio communication was hit or miss, literally. Static, interference and battle damage meant pilots often flew alone even when surrounded by their squadron. You'd lose sight of your wingman in a cloud bank and emerge to find yourself facing 6 enemy fighters with no backup in sight. Navigation was another nightmare. All GPS, just a compass and landmarks that all look the same when you're lost, low on fuel, and hoping that airfield ahead isn't crawling with enemy troops. Weather killed as many pilots as combat did. Ice on the wings at altitude, fog that turned landing strips invisible, storms that tossed fighter planes around like paper airplanes. Many pilots died trying to get home in weather that would ground civilian aircraft without question. But when your squadron was engaged in a critical mission, you flew regardless of conditions. The psychological toll was brutal. Fighter pilots developed their own superstitions and rituals, lucky scarves, specific pre-flight routines, favorite aircraft that they'd refuse to give up. Some talked to their planes like pets. Others went silent for hours before missions. Command rotated pilots regularly, but even short tours could break a man's nerves completely. The really unlucky ones survived being shot down only to face capture, interrogation or worse. Parachuting into enemy territory meant you were completely alone, possibly injured, definitely lost, and carrying nothing but a sidearm and a prayer. Some pilots were rescued by friendly resistance fighters. Others weren't so fortunate. Fighter aces became legends, but for every ace there were dozens of pilots who never made it past their first few missions. The statistics were grim. In some units, pilot life expectancy was measured in weeks, not months. New replacements would arrive, get assigned to quarters, and be gone before anyone learned their names. Yet somehow, despite all this, fighter pilots kept climbing into their cockpits day after day. Maybe it was duty, maybe stubbornness, maybe just the hope that today wouldn't be the day their luck ran out. But speaking of running out of luck, there was another group of airmen who knew they were doomed before they even left the ground. While fighter pilots battled in the sky, another breed of warrior was preparing to leap into the darkness below. Paratroopers didn't just fight the enemy, they jumped straight into their backyard, often with nothing but a prayer and a parachute that might not open. The concept sounds almost ridiculous when you think about it. Take perfectly good soldiers, stuff them into planes, then throw them out over hostile territory in the middle of the night. What could possibly go wrong? Well, pretty much everything. D-Day paratroopers learned this the hard way. On June 5, 1944, over 13,000 American paratroopers loaded into transport planes bound for Normandy. The plan looked neat on paper: drop behind enemy lines, secure key bridges, cause chaos. Reality had other ideas. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the night sky like a deadly fireworks show. Pilots, dodging flak and trying not to die, scattered paratroopers across the French countryside like confetti. Many troopers landed miles from their intended drop zones. Some came down in flooded fields that the Germans had deliberately turned into death traps. Others found themselves hanging from church steeples or tangled in power lines, perfect targets for enemy patrols. The lucky ones hit solid ground and could actually move. But here's where it gets really dangerous. Paratroopers carried an insane amount of gear. We're talking about guys jumping with over 100 pounds of equipment strapped to their bodies. Machine guns, ammunition, radios, medical supplies, explosives, and enough food to last several days. Try doing jumping jacks with that much weight, let alone falling from 1,200 feet in the dark. The parachute itself was basically a big white target screaming "shoot here" to anyone looking up. German machine gunners learned to track the descent and spray bullets at landing zones. Many paratroopers died before their boots touched the ground. Those canvas parachutes offered zero protection against rifle fire. Then there's the landing itself. Paratroopers called it hitting the silk, but hitting the ground was more accurate. Even perfect landings could break bones. Trees, buildings, water, rocks. Everything became a potential death sentence when you're falling at 22 feet per second. Training taught them to roll, but training never prepared them for landing in a minefield or on a concrete bunker. Let's not forget the isolation factor. Unlike regular infantry who advanced with their units, paratroopers often found themselves completely alone in enemy territory. No backup, no supply lines, no easy retreat. Just you, whatever gear survived the landing, and however many bullets you could carry. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions became legendary for a reason. Surviving their missions was almost impossible. Operation Market Garden, in September 1944, showed just how deadly paratrooper missions could become. British paratroopers dropped near Arnhem, found themselves surrounded by German tank divisions that intelligence had missed. They held out for 9 days, but of the roughly 10,000 men who dropped, only about 2,400 made it back across Allied lines. Night jumps added another layer of terror. Paratroopers couldn't see where they were landing until the last few seconds. Was that shadow below a field or a building, water, or solid ground, enemy soldiers or friendly cows? By the time you figured it out, you were already there. Weather turned routine drops into nightmares. Wind could blow entire formations off course or slam troopers into obstacles they never saw coming. Rain made parachutes heavier and less controllable. Fog meant pilots couldn't find drop zones, sometimes dumping paratroopers over enemy strongholds instead of behind friendly lines. Communication equipment rarely survived the landing intact. Radios got smashed, antennas snapped, and frequency crystals shattered. Units designed to work together found themselves operating blind, unable to coordinate or call for support. Many paratroopers spent their entire missions not knowing if anyone else had survived the drop. The psychological pressure was enormous. Regular soldiers could see the enemy coming and prepare. Paratroopers jumped into the unknown, never sure what waited below. Every landing was like playing Russian roulette with gravity and geography. German troops quickly learned to exploit paratrooper vulnerabilities. They set up ambush points near likely landing zones and patrolled drop areas immediately after air raids. Captured paratroopers faced especially harsh treatment. The Germans considered them elite troops and often refused to treat them as regular prisoners of war. But the strangest part, despite casualty rates that would terrify most soldiers, volunteers lined up to join airborne units. The extra pay helped, but mostly these guys genuinely believed in their mission. They knew someone had to go first, clear the way and hold ground until reinforcements arrived. While paratroopers fought to survive their landings, another group of warriors was running straight toward danger on purpose. These brave souls wore red crosses on their helmets, but that didn't stop bullets from finding them. While paratroopers were jumping into danger from above, another group of brave souls was running straight into the crossfire on purpose. Combat medics wore the Red Cross symbol on their helmets and arms, supposedly protecting them under international law. Enemy soldiers were meant to recognize this symbol and avoid shooting medics who were just trying to save lives. Well, that didn't always work out so well. The Geneva Convention said medics shouldn't be targeted. Reality had other plans. German snipers often aimed for the guys with the big red crosses painted on their gear. Why? Because killing a medic meant wounded soldiers couldn't get help. Plus, medics were usually surrounded by other soldiers, making them perfect bait for a well-placed shot. Some medics started covering up their Red Cross symbols just to stay alive longer. But here's the thing about combat medics. They couldn't carry weapons to defend themselves. Their job was saving lives, not taking them. When bullets started flying, everyone else could shoot back. Medics had to rely on their buddies for protection while they crawled through mud and shellfire to reach wounded soldiers. Talk about putting your life in someone else's hands. The worst part wasn't even the enemy shooting at them. It was hearing someone scream medic, and knowing you had to run toward the sound. That scream usually came from the most dangerous spots on the battlefield. Machine gun nests, artillery impact zones, open ground where snipers were picking off anyone who moved. Every time a medic heard that call, they had maybe 3 seconds to decide between their own survival and someone else's life. Let's not forget these guys were working with Stone Age medical supplies compared to what we have today. No fancy equipment. No helicopters to airlift casualties to hospitals. Just basic bandages, morphine, and whatever they could carry in their aid bags. They performed life-saving surgery with pocket knives and hope. Many medics learned to amputate limbs using nothing but a field saw and prayer. Then there's the physical challenge of actually getting wounded soldiers to safety. A grown man in full combat gear weighs around 200 pounds. Add in mud, blood, and the fact that you're being shot at, and dragging someone to cover becomes nearly impossible. Medics developed techniques for moving casualties that looked more like wrestling moves than medical procedures. Some used rifle slings as makeshift stretchers, others just grabbed whatever body part they could reach and pulled. The psychological pressure was insane. Medics had to make split-second decisions about who could be saved and who couldn't. This process, called triage, meant looking at multiple wounded soldiers and deciding who gets help first. The guy screaming the loudest might not be the one in most danger. The quiet one bleeding out in the corner might have minutes to live. Getting that choice wrong meant watching someone die who could have been saved. Medical training before deployment was basic at best. Most medics learned their skills through a few weeks of crash courses, then figured out the rest on the job. They studied anatomy using textbooks, then suddenly found themselves performing emergency surgery in foxholes while mortars exploded overhead. The learning curve was steep, and mistakes had permanent consequences. Combat medics also dealt with wounded soldiers who were completely losing their minds. Shell shock, now called PTSD, turned normal people into unpredictable patients. Some wounded soldiers would fight against medical treatment, thinking the medics were enemy soldiers. Others would grab onto medics and refuse to let go, begging not to be left alone. Treating someone's physical wounds while dealing with their mental breakdown required skills no training manual could teach. Weather made everything worse. Medics worked in freezing rain, desert heat, and ankle-deep mud. Medical supplies froze solid in winter, making bandages impossible to unwrap. In tropical climates, wounds became infected within hours. Sand got into everything, including open injuries. Yet medics kept working, because stopping meant people died. The survival rate for combat medics was lower than most people realize. They were prime targets for enemy fire, worked in the most dangerous areas of battlefields, and couldn't defend themselves effectively. Many medics died while treating their third or fourth patient of the day. Others survived the war but carried psychological scars from watching so many people die despite their best efforts. What made combat medics especially vulnerable was their predictable behavior. Enemy forces knew that wounded soldiers would call for medics, and medics would always respond to those calls. This created perfect ambush opportunities. Snipers would deliberately wound one soldier, then wait for medics to show up before taking their shots. But speaking of people who couldn't shoot back when things got ugly, the regular infantry soldiers faced their own unique set of daily terrors that went far beyond what most people imagine about ground combat. While bomber crews faced death from above and paratroopers jumped into chaos, there was another group that faced danger every single day, often for months at a time. The frontline infantry. These were the soldiers who walked into battle carrying everything they owned, slept in holes they dug with their bare hands, and watched their friends die right next to them. The numbers tell a brutal story. In some infantry divisions, casualty rates reached over 100%. That doesn't mean everyone died. It means they replaced the entire unit more than once during the war. Fresh-faced recruits would join a company, and within weeks half would be dead or wounded. The survivors, they'd get new replacements and watch it happen all over again. Infantry soldiers carried about 70 pounds of gear on their backs. Ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, extra socks and their weapon. Marching 20 miles in a day wasn't unusual, even when you knew the enemy was waiting at the end of that march. Your feet would blister, your shoulders would ache, and you'd still have to dig a foxhole when you finally stopped. Then there were the foxholes themselves. Sounds cozy, right? Wrong. These were shallow holes barely big enough for 1 or 2 men, dug into frozen ground or muddy fields. You'd spend hours digging with a small shovel, trying to get deep enough to avoid shrapnel. Rain would fill them with water, snow would cover you completely, rats would crawl over you while you slept. But the real killer wasn't the conditions, it was the constant threat of death from every direction. Artillery shells could land anywhere, anytime. A sniper might have you in his sights from 400 yards away. Landmines waited under innocent-looking patches of dirt, or machine gun nests could cut down entire squads in seconds. The psychological toll was enormous. Combat fatigue, shell shock, battle neurosis, they had different names for it, but it all meant the same thing. Men who'd seen too much, heard too many explosions, lost too many friends. Some would shake uncontrollably, others would stare into space for hours, many just broke down completely. Disease made everything worse. Trench foot rotted soldiers' feet from standing in wet boots for weeks. Dysentery swept through units like wildfire. Lice and fleas were constant companions. Infections turned minor wounds into life-threatening problems, because proper medical care was miles away. Infantry units developed their own grim humor to cope. They'd name their foxholes like hotels, the Ritz or Paradise Inn. They'd joke about bullets having their names on them. Dark humor, but it kept some men sane when everything else felt insane. The worst part might have been the waiting. Hours of boredom punctuated by moments of absolute terror. You'd sit in your hole, cleaning your rifle for the 100th time, writing letters home you weren't sure would ever get mailed. Then suddenly, all hell would break loose. Veterans described the sound of incoming artillery as the most terrifying noise they'd ever heard. A high-pitched whistle that got louder and louder until the explosion shook the earth around you. You'd press yourself into the bottom of your foxhole and pray it wouldn't land directly on top of you. Sometimes your prayers were answered, sometimes they weren't. Communication was nearly impossible during heavy fighting. Radio operators got targeted by snipers. Telephone wires got cut by explosions. Messages had to be carried by runners who sprinted across open ground while bullets flew over their heads. Many messages never made it to their destination. Winter fighting added another layer of misery. Weapons would freeze and jam. Water in canteens turned to ice. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Some soldiers actually welcomed getting wounded during winter months, because it meant a warm hospital bed, at least temporarily. The infantry faced a unique psychological challenge that other dangerous jobs didn't have. They could see the enemy trying to kill them. Bomber crews dealt with abstract flak and distant fighters. Infantry soldiers looked into the faces of men trying to shoot them. Close quarters combat was personal and brutal. Veteran infantrymen developed a 1,000-yard stare that families back home noticed immediately. They'd survived something that most people couldn't even imagine. Sleep didn't come easily when you'd spent months listening for footsteps in the dark. Supply lines were constant targets, so infantry units often went days without proper food, ammunition, or medical supplies. They'd eat cold rations, ration their bullets, and treat wounds with whatever they could find. Resourcefulness became a survival skill. The average life expectancy of a frontline infantry soldier varied by theater and time period, but it was measured in weeks, not months. New replacements were especially vulnerable. They hadn't learned to read the subtle signs that meant danger, yet these men kept walking forward, one muddy step at a time, because someone had to. But they weren't the only ones putting their lives on the line far from home. Out on the cold, dark seas, other sailors faced a different kind of daily terror that most people never heard about. While bomber crews faced death from above, and infantry soldiers dodged bullets on land, there was another group of men sailing into danger every single day. Minesweeper crews had one of the most nerve-wracking jobs in the entire war. Their mission: clear deadly sea mines that could blow their ship to pieces with one wrong move. These weren't your typical warships loaded with heavy armor and massive guns. Minesweeper vessels were often converted fishing boats, small wooden ships, or hastily built craft that looked more like weekend pleasure boats than military vessels. The irony was brutal. The men tasked with finding the most dangerous explosives in the ocean were doing it from boats that could barely withstand a strong wave, let alone a mine blast. The job itself was simple in theory, but terrifying in practice. Mines floated just below the surface, or sat anchored on the ocean floor, waiting for any ship to get too close. Minesweeper crews used long poles, nets or cables to locate and detonate these underwater bombs. But here's the thing about mines: they don't care if you're trying to clear them or accidentally hit them. One mistake meant the same result: a massive explosion that could split your ship in half. Working conditions made everything worse. Most minesweeping happened at night when enemy planes couldn't spot them as easily. Crews worked in complete darkness, using only touch and instinct to guide their equipment through black water. The North Atlantic was freezing cold year-round, and rough seas made it nearly impossible to see mines bobbing in the waves. Ice formed on deck equipment, making everything slippery and dangerous to handle. Then there were the mines themselves, and they came in more varieties than anyone wanted to know about. Contact mines exploded the moment a ship bumped into them. Magnetic mines detected the metal hull of a ship and triggered automatically. Acoustic mines listened for engine sounds and detonated when they heard the right frequency. Some mines were designed to let the first few ships pass safely, then explode on the fourth or fifth vessel. Others had timers that made them active only during certain hours. The really nasty ones were called influence mines. They could sense changes in water pressure when a ship passed overhead. Minesweeper crews never knew which type they were dealing with until it was too late. A mine that seemed safely deactivated could still have backup triggers waiting to fire. Enemy aircraft and submarines made the job even more deadly. German U-boats specifically hunted minesweepers because they knew these small, slow ships were easy targets. Luftwaffe pilots loved attacking minesweeper crews because the boats couldn't defend themselves. Most carried only light machine guns, if any weapons at all. The crews were sitting ducks, focused on dangerous work below while death could come screaming out of the sky above. Weather was another constant enemy. Storms in the North Sea and Atlantic could sink a minesweeper just as effectively as any mine. High waves made it impossible to spot floating mines until they were right next to the ship. Strong currents dragged mines away from their expected positions, creating deadly surprises in supposedly cleared areas. Fog reduced visibility to zero, forcing crews to work blind in waters they knew were filled with explosives. The mental pressure was crushing. Every sound could be a mine scraping against the hull. Every vibration might be the last thing they ever felt. Crews developed superstitions and rituals to cope with the stress. Some refused to shave before a mission. Others carried lucky charms or said specific prayers. Many couldn't sleep the night before heading out to clear mines. What made it worse was knowing that their work was mostly invisible. When minesweepers did their job perfectly, nothing happened. Ships passed safely through cleared channels and nobody noticed. Success meant anonymity. Failure meant spectacular death that everyone would remember. The pressure to be perfect every single time wore down even the toughest sailors. Communication with other ships was difficult and dangerous. Radio signals could trigger some types of mines, so crews often worked in radio silence. Hand signals and light flashes were the only way to coordinate with other vessels, but these methods didn't work well in bad weather or darkness. Many minesweeper crews were completely on their own once they entered a minefield. The casualty rates were staggering, though exact numbers were kept secret to avoid hurting morale. Entire minesweeper crews could vanish in seconds when a mine detonated directly under their boat. Survivors were rare. The small ships usually went down too fast for anyone to escape. Those who did make it into the water faced freezing temperatures that killed within minutes. But while minesweeper crews battled death on the surface, another group of sailors faced an entirely different kind of nightmare. Deep beneath the waves, submarine crews were discovering that the ocean floor could become their tomb in ways that made even mine explosions seem quick and merciful. Bombs falling overhead, enemy fighters circling above, and your only escape route, well, there isn't one. Welcome to life aboard a World War II submarine, where the ocean becomes both your weapon and your potential grave. These steel tubes packed with torpedoes and desperate men faced dangers that would make even the bravest souls think twice. Picture being trapped underwater for weeks at a time. No fresh air, no sunlight. Just the constant hum of engines and the knowledge that hundreds of feet of crushing water surround your metal coffin. Submariners lived in spaces so cramped that tall men couldn't stand upright. They shared bunks in shifts, slept next to torpedoes and breathed air that grew more toxic by the day. The real terror, enemy depth charges. These underwater bombs were designed to crack submarine hulls like eggshells. When destroyers detected a sub below, they'd drop these weapons in patterns, hoping to catch their prey. The explosions would shake the entire vessel, throwing men against bulkheads and shattering gauges. Light bulbs burst, pipes leaked, and everyone held their breath, waiting to see if the next blast would be their last. German U-boat crews faced absolutely brutal odds. Early in the war they dominated the seas, sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. But as the war dragged on, Allied forces developed better detection methods. sonar improved, aircraft patrols increased. By 1943, being assigned to a U-boat was essentially a death sentence. 3 out of 4 German submariners never made it home. Think about that ratio for a second. Then there's the psychological warfare of submarine combat. These crews operated in complete silence for hours, sometimes days. One dropped wrench, one cough at the wrong moment, and enemy ships above would pinpoint their location. Imagine trying to repair critical equipment while tiptoeing around like you're sneaking past a sleeping giant. Except this giant wants to kill you, and has explosive depth charges to prove it. Fire presented another nightmare scenario. In the confined space of a submarine, flames spread quickly, and smoke had nowhere to go. Electrical fires were especially dangerous because seawater and electricity make a deadly combination. Crews trained endlessly for fire drills, but when your escape routes are limited and you're surrounded by explosive torpedoes, training only goes so far. American submarine crews in the Pacific faced their own unique horrors. Japanese destroyers were fast and aggressive, hunting subs with relentless determination. But the really scary part: defective torpedoes. Early in the war, American torpedoes had a nasty habit of running in circles after being fired. More than one submarine crew watched in horror as their own torpedo came back to sink them. Talk about adding insult to injury. Soviet submarine crews dealt with conditions that would break most people. Their boats were often older, less reliable, and packed beyond capacity. Mechanical failures were common, spare parts were scarce, and medical care was basically non-existent. When things went wrong hundreds of feet underwater, Soviet submariners had to fix problems with whatever they could find or face certain death. The escape options after a submarine was hit: practically zero. Unlike surface ships where you could jump overboard or launch lifeboats, sinking submarines became underwater tombs. The water pressure at depth meant that even if compartments stayed intact after an attack, rescue was nearly impossible. Some crews managed to surface in damaged boats, but many simply disappeared beneath the waves forever. Life support systems added another layer of danger. Air recycling equipment could fail, leaving crews to slowly suffocate on their own carbon dioxide. Fresh water was rationed strictly, and food supplies often ran low on extended patrols. Men developed vitamin deficiency diseases, lost dangerous amounts of weight, and dealt with infections that couldn't be properly treated in the cramped, unsanitary conditions. Navigation presented constant challenges too. Submarines relied on dead reckoning when submerged, essentially guessing their position based on speed and direction. Surface briefly to get a position fix, and you risk being spotted by enemy aircraft. Stay submerged too long, and you might surface in the middle of an enemy fleet. Either choice could be fatal. Weather added yet another variable. Storms could damage exposed equipment when submarines surfaced to charge batteries or get fresh air. Ice in northern waters could damage periscopes or prevent emergency surfacing. Even calm seas presented problems because they made submarines easier to spot from the air. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect was the uncertainty. Unlike infantry, who could see their enemies, or pilots who fought in open sky, submarine crews operated blind most of the time. They listened to sonar pings, tracked distant engine sounds, and made life or death decisions based on fragments of information. One wrong guess about an enemy ship's position or speed could mean sailing directly into an ambush. While submariners faced death from below the waves, another group of sailors fought their own deadly battle on the surface, carrying vital supplies through waters infested with the very submarines we just discussed. While paratroopers jumped behind enemy lines and bomber crews faced flak over Germany, another group of men sailed into what became known as the world's most dangerous shipping lanes. They weren't soldiers, they weren't marines. They were merchant mariners, and their job was simple: keep America's allies supplied with food, fuel, and weapons. Simple in theory, deadly in practice. The statistics tell a brutal story. Nearly 10,000 American merchant mariners died during World War II. That's more than the entire Marine Corps lost in the Pacific. These weren't combat troops trained for warfare. They were ordinary sailors, many of them teenagers, hauling cargo across oceans, crawling with German U-boats. The casualty rate for merchant mariners was higher than any branch of the military except the Army Air Forces. Let that sink in for a moment. The Germans called the waters off the American coast the second happy time. Happy for them, terrifying for everyone else. U-boat captains racked up kills like they were playing a deadly video game. Merchant ships burned off the beaches of Virginia and North Carolina so regularly that coastal residents could see the glow from shore. Vacationers in Miami watched tankers explode on the horizon while sipping cocktails. The war had come to America's doorstep, and merchant mariners were dying just miles from home. But the worst assignment, the Murmansk Run to the Soviet Union. This route earned the nickname Suicide Run for good reason. Ships had to navigate around Nazi-occupied Norway, dodge German bombers flying from airfields in Finland, and survive wolf packs of submarines lurking beneath the Arctic ice. The water temperature hovered around 32 degrees. Fall overboard, and you had maybe 4 minutes before hypothermia killed you. 4 minutes if you were lucky. Convoy PQ-17 became the poster child for maritime disaster. 78 Allied ships set sail for Murmansk in June 1942. Only 11 made it through. The rest were torpedoed, bombed or simply abandoned when the convoy scattered after receiving false intelligence about German surface ships. Hundreds of sailors died in those freezing waters, watching their shipmates disappear beneath the waves. The cargo they carried, tanks, planes, ammunition, sat on the ocean floor instead of helping the Red Army. Then there's the psychological warfare aspect that nobody talks about. U-boat commanders deliberately targeted tankers first because they created the most spectacular explosions. A torpedoed oil tanker didn't just sink, it became a floating inferno. Burning oil spread across the water's surface, turning rescue operations into death traps. Survivors faced an impossible choice: stay in lifeboats surrounded by flames, or jump into oil-slicked water that would kill them within minutes. The merchant marine attracted an unusual mix of people. Veterans of World War I sailed alongside 16-year-old kids who lied about their age to get aboard. Some were patriots answering their country's call. Others were simply men who needed work and couldn't afford to be picky about the danger involved. A few were running from something: bad marriages, criminal records, or just the mundane reality of Depression-era America. The sea didn't care about your motivations when a torpedo hit your engine room. Communication added another layer of terror. Radio operators couldn't broadcast distress signals immediately because German U-boats used those transmissions to locate other targets. Ships often sank without anyone knowing they were in trouble. Rescue vessels would arrive at predetermined coordinates and find nothing but oil slicks and debris. Entire crews simply vanished, their families receiving telegrams months later, stating their loved ones were missing at sea. Weather became an enemy as brutal as any German submarine. Atlantic storms in winter could snap a Liberty ship in half. Ice storms turned deck work into a death sentence. One wrong step on a frozen surface meant sliding overboard into water that would stop your heart in seconds. Hurricane-force winds turned routine cargo operations into life-or-death struggles. Men lashed themselves to deck equipment just to avoid being swept into the ocean. The irony cuts deep when you consider these sailors received almost no recognition during the war. Military personnel got medals, parades, and heroes' welcomes. Merchant mariners got paychecks that stopped the moment their ship sank. They weren't considered veterans until the 1980s. 40 years after the war ended, America finally acknowledged that hauling supplies through submarine-infested waters might qualify as military service. Life aboard a merchant vessel meant living with constant awareness that death could arrive without warning. A torpedo hitting the engine room gave you maybe 90 seconds to reach the deck before the ship went under. Most merchant vessels carried minimal defensive weapons, a few machine guns and maybe one small cannon. Facing German submarines with that kind of firepower was like bringing a knife to a gunfight, a very small knife, but for every ship that went down, others made it through. Their cargo kept Britain fighting and Russia supplied with the materials needed to push back the Wehrmacht. These ordinary sailors, many barely old enough to vote, played a crucial role in keeping the Allied war machine running. Speaking of keeping the war machine running, some soldiers found themselves in positions where retreat wasn't just discouraged, it was forbidden under penalty of death. The Soviet army had a special unit that most people have never heard of. They called them penal battalions, but that polite name hid something much darker. These weren't regular soldiers who volunteered to fight for their country. These were men who had been sentenced to what was basically a death sentence with extra steps. Here's how it worked. A soldier gets caught stealing food because he's starving. Court-martial. A commander retreats when he should have held the line. Court-martial. Someone makes a joke about Stalin within earshot of the wrong person. You guessed it. Instead of shooting these men right away, the Soviet system had a more creative punishment. They'd strip away their rank, take their decent equipment, and throw them into what they called punishment companies. But calling them punishment companies was like calling a tornado a strong breeze. These units got sent to the absolute worst parts of any battle, the most dangerous attacks, the most hopeless missions, the places where even experienced soldiers knew they probably wouldn't come back. The numbers tell the real story here. Regular Soviet infantry units had brutal casualty rates, sometimes losing half their men in major battles. Penal battalions, they regularly saw 80 or 90% casualties. That's not a military unit. That's a meat grinder with paperwork. What made this job so deadly wasn't just where they got sent, though that was bad enough. It was what they got sent there with. While regular troops got decent rifles, ammunition, and basic supplies, penal battalion soldiers often went into battle with whatever scraps were left over. Sometimes they got rifles with no bullets. Sometimes they got bullets with no rifles. The idea was simple and horrible. If you survive long enough to prove your loyalty, maybe we'll give you real equipment. Then there's the famous Order 227, also known as Not One Step Back. This wasn't just a motivational poster. Stalin meant it literally. Behind the penal battalions, the Soviets placed what they called blocking units. These were soldiers whose only job was to shoot anyone who tried to retreat. So picture this, you're in a penal battalion, sent against German machine gun nests with barely any weapons, and if you try to fall back, your own side shoots you. The only direction you can go is forward, toward the enemy guns. The really twisted part. Sometimes they'd send these men on missions that were designed to fail. Need to find out where the German artillery is positioned. Send a penal battalion to attack that area. When they get blown to pieces, you'll know exactly where the guns are hidden. It was using human beings as expendable reconnaissance tools. One former penal battalion survivor described being sent to attack a German tank position with nothing but grenades and a prayer. Not anti-tank weapons, regular hand grenades, against tanks. The idea was that maybe, if enough men rushed at once, someone might get close enough to damage a tank before getting killed. Most didn't make it within 50 yards. The psychological warfare was almost as brutal as the physical danger. These men knew they were considered disposable by their own command. They'd watch regular Soviet troops get pulled back when situations got too dangerous, while they got ordered to stay and fight impossible battles. Some developed a dark gallows humor about their situation, joking that they were already dead and just hadn't fallen down yet. Weather made everything worse. During the brutal Russian winters, regular troops at least got some cold weather gear. Penal battalions often went into battle wearing summer uniforms in sub-zero temperatures. Frostbite killed almost as many as German bullets. But complaining about the cold was considered insubordination, which could extend your sentence in the unit. The cruel irony was that some of these men were actually excellent soldiers. They'd been sentenced for minor infractions or political problems, not cowardice. Many fought with desperate courage, knowing that their only chance of survival was to somehow prove themselves worthy of transfer back to regular units. But the system was designed to prevent that from happening very often. Even if you survived long enough to potentially earn redemption, there was no guarantee you'd be released from penal battalion service. Some men served multiple sentences back to back for new infractions that happened while they were already being punished. It became a trap that was almost impossible to escape. The German army, brutal as it was, didn't have anything quite like this. They had punishment units too, but nothing that systematically fed soldiers into hopeless battles as a matter of policy. The Soviet penal battalions represented something uniquely devastating, your own army treating you as ammunition rather than as human beings. While these men faced impossible odds on every mission, there was another group dealing with a completely different kind of deadly job. These soldiers knew from the moment they volunteered that they would never come home. Walking through a minefield, knowing that one wrong step could blow you to pieces, that was Tuesday for a sapper. These engineers crawled on their bellies, probing the ground inch by inch with bayonets and bare hands, clearing paths so troops could advance without getting turned into confetti. The job description was simple enough. Find the mines, disarm them, mark safe routes. Reality, well, that's where things got messy. German engineers had gotten creative with their explosive surprises. Some mines were designed to pop up waist-high before exploding, maximizing damage to anyone nearby. Others were so sensitive that even the vibration from a passing truck could set them off. The really nasty ones came with anti-tampering devices that exploded if you tried to defuse them incorrectly. Then there were the bridge builders. While artillery shells screamed overhead and enemy snipers took potshots at anyone who moved, these guys had to construct river crossings under fire. They worked in teams, some holding wooden planks while others hammered nails, all while hoping the next mortar round wouldn't land right on top of them. The pressure was insane because without bridges, entire offensives would grind to a halt. What made it worse was the time factor. Armies don't wait around for perfect conditions. When commanders needed a bridge built, they needed it yesterday. This meant sappers often worked through the night using minimal lighting to avoid attracting enemy attention. Try hammering straight when you can barely see your own hands and machine gun bullets are zipping past your ears every few minutes. The demolition specialists faced their own special brand of terror. These sappers carried enough explosives to level buildings, which made them walking targets. Getting hit by shrapnel was bad enough, but when you're carrying dynamite and TNT, even a small piece of metal could turn you into a crater. They had to crawl up to enemy fortifications, plant charges, and get out before the timer ran down. Miss your exit window by even a few seconds, and you'd be finding out what it feels like to become part of the explosion. But here's what really messed with their heads. The mistakes were permanent. A machine gunner could miss his target and try again. A pilot could abort a mission and come back tomorrow. Sappers, one miscalculation, and there wasn't enough left of them to fill a coffee cup. The psychological pressure of knowing that every decision could be your last decision wore down even the toughest guys. The casualty rates among combat engineers were brutal. Some units lost over half their men in major operations. The problem was that their work had to be done in the most dangerous places on the battlefield. While other soldiers could take cover in foxholes or behind trees, sappers had to work in open areas where everyone could see them. Enemy commanders knew that stopping the engineers meant stopping the advance, so they made these guys priority targets. Equipment didn't help much either. Early in the war, mine detectors were unreliable pieces of junk that gave false readings more often than they found actual mines. Many sappers learned to trust their instincts and experience over the gadgets. They developed techniques like listening for hollow sounds in the ground or looking for slight color changes in disturbed soil, but even the best could miss something. Weather made everything 10 times harder. Rain turned minefields into muddy swamps where every step could be your last slip. Snow covered visual clues that might reveal buried explosives. Hot sun made the metal components in mines expand, sometimes triggering them unexpectedly, and working with explosives in freezing temperatures meant handling materials that could become unstable if not kept at the right temperature. The weird part is how methodical they had to be, while chaos erupted around them. While buildings exploded and bullets flew, sappers moved with the precision of surgeons. Rush the job, and people die. Take too long and people die. The balance between speed and accuracy required nerves that most people simply didn't have. Some of the bravest work happened during urban combat. When cities became battlefields, sappers had to clear booby traps from houses, disable explosives planted in sewers, and build defensive positions while civilians ran screaming through the streets. Every door could hide a tripwire. Every staircase might be rigged to collapse. What kept them going was knowing that their work saved lives. Every mine cleared meant infantry soldiers could advance safely. Every bridge built meant supplies could reach the front lines. The mathematics were simple. Risk a few lives to save many more. Makes sense, right? While sappers dealt with explosives on land, other specialists faced different but equally deadly challenges on the water. Some jobs required split-second timing where there was absolutely no room for error. Look, most dangerous jobs in wartime involved some chance of survival, maybe slim chances, but still chances. Then there were the kamikaze pilots. Their job description literally included dying. Know if you're lucky, or with proper training you might make it home. Just death. Guaranteed death. And somehow thousands of young Japanese men lined up to do it. The whole kamikaze program started when Japan was getting absolutely hammered by Allied forces in 1944. Their navy was running out of experienced pilots. Their ships were being sunk faster than they could build new ones. Traditional tactics weren't working anymore, so someone in the Japanese high command had what they thought was a brilliant idea. Why waste expensive ammunition when you could just crash the entire plane into enemy ships? They called it kamikaze, meaning divine wind. Named after those legendary typhoons that supposedly saved Japan from Mongol invasions centuries earlier. Poetic name for what was essentially a suicide mission with wings. Here's what made this job uniquely terrifying. Most dangerous jobs gave you some illusion of control. Tank crews could bail out if their vehicle caught fire. Bomber crews had parachutes. Even infantry soldiers could duck, run, or surrender if things went completely sideways. But kamikaze pilots, their success was measured by their death. The better they did their job, the deader they got. The training was almost insulting in its brevity. Regular pilots spent years learning to fly, fight, and most importantly land safely. Kamikaze pilots got maybe 30 hours of flight training, just enough to take off, fly straight, and aim at a big target. Landing lessons were obviously unnecessary. Talk about job-specific training. Most of these pilots were barely out of their teens. University students really. Guys who should have been worried about exams and girlfriends instead found themselves writing farewell letters to their families. They'd sit in barracks the night before missions, knowing they'd never see another sunrise. The psychological pressure must have been crushing. But here's the thing that really gets you. Many of these pilots weren't exactly volunteers in the traditional sense. Sure, they raised their hands when asked, but peer pressure in wartime Japan was intense. Not volunteering for kamikaze duty meant being branded a coward. Your family would face shame. Your ancestors would be dishonored. Some choice, right? The ritual before missions was elaborate and heartbreaking. Pilots would put on special ceremonial headbands. They'd drink sake and eat special meals. Write final letters home. Some even cut locks of hair to send to their mothers. All very dignified and traditional. Then they'd climb into planes that were essentially flying bombs and fly towards certain death. Their planes weren't even the good ones anymore. By 1945, Japan was using training aircraft, old bombers, anything that could fly and carry explosives. Some kamikaze planes were literally held together with prayers and spare parts. Engine failure was common, which created this bizarre situation where mechanical problems might actually save a pilot's life by forcing him to turn back. The success rate was surprisingly low, considering the commitment involved. Most kamikaze attacks missed their targets completely. Allied ships had gotten really good at shooting down incoming aircraft. Radar gave them advance warning. Anti-aircraft guns created walls of deadly flak. Fighter planes intercepted kamikazes before they could reach their targets. So these pilots were dying for missions that often failed anyway. And the weird part is how the other Japanese military personnel viewed them. Kamikaze pilots were treated like living saints. Everyone bowed to them. They got the best food, the most respect, special privileges. But also everyone knew they were walking dead men. Conversations with kamikaze pilots must have been incredibly awkward. What do you say to someone who's definitely going to be dead tomorrow? Some pilots had second thoughts at the last minute. Flying toward an enemy ship, seeing the anti-aircraft fire, watching other planes explode around them. A few turned back, but returning from a kamikaze mission brought intense shame. Some pilots who came back were sent on another mission immediately. Others faced court-martial. The pressure to die was enormous. The final months of the war saw thousands of these suicide missions. Young men who could have lived full lives instead chose to become human missiles. They believed they were saving Japan, protecting their families, serving their emperor. Whether their sacrifice actually helped Japan's war effort is debatable. What's not debatable is the sheer courage it took to climb into those planes. While kamikaze pilots faced certain death in the skies, another group of warriors was dealing with almost certain death on the ground. But at least tank crews had steel armor around them, even if that armor sometimes became their tomb. Tank crews in World War II faced a nightmare that most people never understood. You climb into 30 tons of steel, thinking you're protected. Well, you're wrong. Tanks weren't shields, they were death traps on tracks. The Sherman tank, America's main battle tank, had a nasty reputation among its own crews. They called it the Ronson because it lit up like the popular cigarette lighter. One hit from enemy fire, and the whole thing could burst into flames in seconds. German tank crews had their own nickname for Shermans, Tommy Cookers. Not exactly a confidence booster when you're the one inside. Space inside these metal boxes was impossibly tight. 5 men crammed together like sardines, surrounded by ammunition, fuel, and red-hot machinery. The driver sat in front, completely blind, except for a tiny periscope. Behind him, the gunner and commander squeezed into the turret with barely enough room to turn around. The loader had to grab heavy shells and slam them into the cannon while the whole tank bounced and shook. And somewhere in this chaos sat the radio operator, trying to hear orders over the deafening noise of the engine and gunfire. Temperature control didn't exist. Summer battles in North Africa or Italy turned tanks into ovens. Crews passed out from heat exhaustion while fighting. Winter on the Eastern Front meant the opposite problem, metal so cold it could freeze skin on contact. But you couldn't wear thick gloves because you needed to operate tiny controls and switches. German tanks hit harder than anything the Allies had early in the war. A single Tiger tank could knock out several Shermans before they got close enough to return fire. Tank crews knew this math. They knew that in a straight fight, they usually lost. The only advantage was numbers. Send enough tanks and maybe some would survive to complete the mission. Escape from a burning tank was nearly impossible. Hatches were small, designed when tanks were lighter and simpler. Once the shooting started, commanders had to choose between keeping hatches closed for protection or open for quick escape. Most of the time they stayed closed. Fatal mistake if the tank got hit. Fire spread faster than anyone expected. Fuel, hydraulic fluid, and ammunition created an explosive mixture. Crews had maybe 10 seconds to get out once flames started. But 10 seconds feels like nothing when you're panicking, wearing heavy gear, and trying to squeeze through a hatch barely wider than your shoulders. Many tank crews died, not from the initial hit, but from being trapped inside their own vehicle. Then there's the psychological warfare aspect that nobody talks about. Enemy forces specifically targeted tanks first in any battle. You're the biggest threat, so you get the most attention. Anti-tank guns, artillery, infantry with bazookas, aircraft with bombs, everyone wanted to kill you first. Driving a tank meant painting a giant target on yourself and 4 friends. The weird part is how tanks became magnets for enemy fire, even when they tried to hide. A tank engine running sounds like a freight train. You can hear it from miles away. Dust clouds from tank tracks were visible for hours. Radio chatter gave away positions to anyone listening. Stealth was impossible, so crews had to rely on speed and firepower. Not exactly comforting when you're outnumbered and outgunned. Soviet tank crews faced even worse odds on the Eastern Front. Early war T-34, Sang had no radios, so tank commanders had to stick their heads out of hatches to communicate with other tanks. German snipers specifically looked for these exposed heads. Later models got radios, but Soviet tank factories were so rushed that quality control barely existed. Tanks broke down constantly, leaving crews stranded in enemy territory. Battle of Kursk showed just how deadly tank warfare could get. Thousands of tanks fought across open fields for days. The lucky crews were the ones whose tanks got disabled early, at least they could bail out and run. Crews in working tanks had to keep fighting until their luck ran out. Most Sherman tank crews in Europe had a life expectancy measured in weeks, not months. Maintenance made everything worse. Tank crews had to fix their own vehicles between battles, often under enemy fire. Changing a broken track took hours of back-breaking work with heavy tools. One mistake and the track could snap back and crush someone. But without working tanks, infantry had no armored support, so the pressure to get back in the fight never stopped. Japanese tank crews faced a different nightmare entirely. Their tanks were lighter and faster than German or American models, but offered almost no protection against newer anti-tank weapons. By 1944, American bazookas could punch through Japanese tank armor like paper. Many Japanese tank crews switched to kamikaze tactics, deliberately ramming enemy positions because conventional tank combat had become suicide. Medical care for tank crews was practically non-existent during battles. Burns from fires, broken bones from impacts and wounds from shrapnel were common, but medics couldn't reach disabled tanks under fire. Crews either escaped on their own or didn't escape at all. But while tanks rolled across battlefields as mobile coffins, an even more dangerous job waited for those who had to guide helpless aircraft toward enemy territory with no engine to save them. You know how every war movie has that scene where troops jump out of planes with parachutes billowing dramatically? Well, glider pilots got the raw end of that deal. No engines, no second chances, just gravity and hope. These guys flew what were basically oversized paper airplanes into combat zones. The military called them flying coffins, and honestly that wasn't much of an exaggeration. Picture being handed the keys to a wooden aircraft with no motor and told to land it perfectly behind enemy lines while people are shooting at you. Makes sense they had one of the war's most dangerous jobs, right? The whole concept sounds insane when you think about it. Transport planes would tow these gliders up to altitude, then release them like giant kites. From that moment on, physics took over. No throttle to give you more speed. No engine to get you out of trouble. Just wind, wings and whatever landing spot you could find before you became a very expensive lawn dart. But here's the thing that made it even worse. Gliders weren't just carrying a pilot and maybe a passenger. These things were packed with troops, jeeps, artillery pieces, medical supplies, and anything else the army needed delivered behind enemy lines. A single glider might carry 20 soldiers plus their equipment. All of them depending on one pilot to get them down in one piece. The training was minimal compared to other aviation roles. Most glider pilots got maybe 40 hours of practice before they were shipped off to war. 40 hours to master an aircraft that had no margin for error. Regular pilots could practice emergency landings knowing they had engines to help. Glider pilots practiced crashing, basically. Every landing was an emergency landing. D-Day showed just how brutal this job really was. Hundreds of gliders launched toward Normandy in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6th. They were supposed to land in designated fields, unload their cargo and support the beach landings. What actually happened was chaos with wings. Many pilots couldn't see their landing zones in the dark. Others got shot at by both German and Allied forces. Nobody could tell friend from foe when these silent aircraft appeared out of nowhere. Some gliders landed in flooded fields that looked solid from the air. Others hit trees, buildings, or crashed into each other. The lucky ones just broke a few bones. Then there's the construction issue. Most gliders were made of wood and fabric because they needed to be lightweight. This meant they offered about as much protection as a garden shed. Machine gun bullets went through them like they weren't even there. Artillery fragments could slice through the fuselage like paper. If you hit something hard during landing, the whole aircraft might just come apart around you. The worst part? Once you landed, you were done being a pilot and became infantry. Gliders couldn't take off again. They were one-way tickets. So after surviving the flight and landing, pilots grabbed rifles and joined whatever battle was happening nearby. They trained to fly, but ended up fighting on foot in unfamiliar territory. Some missions were even more desperate. When the Germans surrounded Allied forces at Bastogne, glider pilots volunteered to fly supplies into the encircled town. They knew the landing zones were probably under fire. They knew German fighters were hunting for them. They went anyway because soldiers were running out of ammunition and medical supplies. Weather made everything worse. Crosswinds could flip a glider during landing. Fog meant flying blind until the last few hundred feet. Ice on the wings changed how the aircraft handled. Rain turned landing fields into mud pits that grabbed landing gear and flipped aircraft nose first into the ground. Unlike powered planes that could abort and try again, glider pilots had to commit to whatever conditions they found. The psychological pressure was unique too. Bomber crews and fighter pilots knew their engines might fail, but they had some control over their fate. Glider pilots surrendered that control the moment they disconnected from the tow plane. After that, it was all about reading air currents, judging distances, and hoping their wooden aircraft held together long enough to reach the ground. Enemy forces learned to listen for the whisper of glider wings cutting through air. German troops called them death birds because they brought reinforcements silently in the night. Anti-aircraft guns would sweep the sky, firing at sounds rather than visible targets. Searchlights would suddenly illuminate these fragile aircraft, making them perfect targets for every gun within range. But perhaps the most dangerous job wasn't flying through flak or dodging fighters. Sometimes the real danger came from the people you were trying to help. Spies and secret agents faced threats that could literally come from anyone, anywhere, at any time, walking through occupied Paris with forged papers tucked inside your coat pocket. One wrong accent, one suspicious glance from a German patrol, and you're dead. Welcome to the world of wartime spies and couriers, where every conversation could be your last. The Special Operations Executive recruited people who looked perfectly ordinary. Teachers, shopkeepers, housewives, anyone who could blend into a crowd without raising eyebrows. But here's the brutal truth. Female couriers working for SOE had a 42% chance of dying. Nearly half of them never made it home. Those aren't gambling odds you'd take at a casino, yet thousands of women volunteered anyway. Take Violette Sabo, a young mother who left her baby daughter to parachute into Nazi-occupied France. She carried coded messages between resistance cells pretending to be just another woman running errands. Her cover story, she was visiting relatives. Simple enough, right? Well, it worked until it didn't. Captured by the SS, tortured for information, then executed at Ravensbrück concentration camp. She was 23 years old. The training these agents received sounds almost comically inadequate for the dangers they faced. A few weeks learning to shoot, some basic explosives handling, and crash courses in maintaining false identities. Then they'd get dropped behind enemy lines with nothing but fake documents and their wits. No backup teams waiting, no extraction plans if things went sideways. Just you, alone, in a country where everyone might be watching. But why were the death rates so horrifically high? German counterintelligence wasn't staffed by amateurs. The Gestapo had informants everywhere, Marbers who listened to conversations, waitresses who memorized faces, neighbors who tracked comings and goings. One resistance member, Getting caught often meant entire networks getting rolled up within days. Then, there's the psychological pressure that never let up. Imagine maintaining a fake identity for months while knowing that one slip of the tongue means certain death. You can't use your real name, talk about your family, or mention anything from your actual life. Some agents cracked under the strain and made fatal mistakes. Others held up remarkably well until capture. Female couriers faced unique challenges that made their jobs even deadlier. German soldiers were more likely to search women thoroughly, looking for hidden messages or weapons. But women could also move more freely during daylight hours without attracting suspicion. A man walking alone might get questioned, but a woman carrying a shopping basket, she was just another civilian trying to find food during wartime rationing. The methods for hiding messages got incredibly creative out of pure necessity. Secret ink made from urine or lemon juice. Messages written on rice paper that could be swallowed quickly if danger appeared. Some female agents hid microfilm in their makeup compacts or sewed coded letters into the lining of their clothes. Others memorized everything and carried nothing written down at all. Getting caught meant facing interrogation techniques designed to break people completely. The Gestapo didn't just ask polite questions, they used torture, threats against family members, and psychological manipulation. Many agents knew their comrades' real names and locations, information that could save or doom dozens of other operatives. Staying silent under that kind of pressure required superhuman willpower. Radio operators faced a different but equally deadly set of risks. Every transmission sent location signals that German direction-finding equipment could track. The longer you stayed on the air, the easier it became for enemy teams to triangulate your position. Most radio operators had to pack up and move constantly, never broadcasting from the same spot twice. Even then, many got caught mid-transmission. The really twisted part, some captured agents got turned and forced to send false messages back to London under German supervision. British intelligence tried to include security checks in transmissions to verify the operator was still free, but desperate agents sometimes forgot to include them during stressful moments. This led to more agents being dropped directly into German hands. Living a double life took incredible mental discipline. You needed to remember which story you'd told to which person, maintain consistent behavior patterns, and never show fear even when your heart was pounding. Some agents developed elaborate mental techniques for staying calm under pressure, but others just had to rely on natural acting ability and pure luck. The physical dangers were constant too, carrying messages through checkpoints, meeting contacts in bombed-out buildings, traveling on trains that might get strafed by fighter planes. Normal wartime hazards became amplified when you were already operating illegally in enemy territory. What made people volunteer for work with such terrible survival odds? Some wanted revenge against occupying forces, others believed deeply in the cause of liberation, many just felt they had skills the war effort needed, regardless of personal risk. While spies worked in shadows and deception, other jobs required building things under direct enemy fire. Combat engineers had their own unique ways of facing death, while spies and couriers were sneaking through enemy territory with fake papers and hidden messages. Another group was working just as dangerously but with completely different tools. These weren't people carrying secrets in their shoes or hollow buttons. They carried hammers, shovels, and blueprints. Combat engineers had one of the most thankless jobs of the war, and frankly one of the deadliest. Here's the thing about engineers in wartime, they didn't get to hide in trenches or behind trees like regular infantry. Their job was to go where the fighting was thickest and make things work. Roads blown up by retreating enemies. Engineers had to fix them while artillery shells whistled overhead. Bridge destroyed to stop an advance. Engineers waded into rivers under sniper fire to build new ones. The math was brutal. Combat engineers died at rates that made even hardened infantry officers wince. Why? Because they worked in the open, often alone, usually ahead of the main force. They were sitting ducks with tool belts. Take bridge building, which sounds peaceful enough until you realize engineers did this job, while enemy machine gunners had perfect shots at them from across the river. Picture trying to hammer wooden planks together, while bullets zip past your ears. Engineers in Italy spent weeks building pontoon bridges across rivers like the Pont, working mostly at night to avoid getting picked off. But even in darkness, the sound of construction work carried for miles. Enemy artillery would zero in on the noise. Then there's the demolition work, which was equally nerve-wracking but in reverse. When Allied forces had to retreat, engineers stayed behind to blow up anything useful to the enemy. Railways, fuel depots, ammunition stores, all had to be destroyed quickly and thoroughly. The catch, they had to time these explosions perfectly. Too early, and their own forces couldn't use the resources. Too late, and they'd be doing the work with German tanks rolling toward them. Soviet engineers faced some of the most impossible conditions. During the siege of Stalingrad, they had to keep supply routes open while the city was literally falling apart around them. They'd repair a road section during the night, only to find it crater-filled again by morning. Some engineer units lost 80% of their men just trying to keep one supply line functional for a week. But here's where it gets really wild. Engineers also had to think backward. Part of their job was making life difficult for the enemy by destroying infrastructure as they advanced. This meant they were constantly switching between building things and blowing things up, sometimes on the same day. An engineer might spend the morning repairing a bridge for Allied tanks, then spend the afternoon wiring a different bridge with explosives to deny it to pursuing German forces. The Pacific Theater brought its own special brand of misery for combat engineers. Building airstrips on coral islands meant working under the blazing sun while Japanese snipers took pot shots from hidden positions in the jungle. The coral was so hard it broke equipment constantly, and the heat made metal tools too hot to touch with bare hands. Engineers on Iwo Jima had to build landing strips while the battle was still raging just a few hundred yards away. Equipment failures added another layer of danger. Engineers relied on heavy machinery that broke down constantly in combat conditions. A bulldozer that quit working in the middle of clearing a minefield left its operator stranded in the most dangerous spot possible. Repair crews had to sprint out under fire to fix machinery, then sprint back. Many didn't make it. Communication was another nightmare. Engineers often worked so far ahead of main forces that radio contact was spotty or non-existent. They made critical decisions about where to build, what to blow up, and how to route supply lines without being able to check with headquarters. Wrong guesses cost lives, sometimes hundreds of them. Weather made everything worse. Engineers building the Burma Road worked through monsoon rains that washed away entire sections they'd just completed. Eastern Front engineers dealt with mud that swallowed vehicles whole, then froze solid overnight. Desert engineers in North Africa worked in sandstorms that clogged machinery and made accurate measurements impossible. The really twisted part: engineers rarely got credit for their work. When an attack succeeded, generals praised the tank crews or infantry. When engineers saved the day by getting supplies through or building a crucial bridge, it was treated as just doing their job. But when something went wrong, a bridge collapsed, a road washed out, everyone blamed the engineers. Most combat engineers were drafted civilians who'd been construction workers, mechanics or farmers before the war. They learned military engineering on the job, which meant making potentially fatal mistakes while enemy forces tried to kill them. Not exactly ideal training conditions, or while engineers were getting shot at for fixing roads and building bridges, another group of soldiers was dealing with an entirely different kind of target on their backs. While fighter pilots grabbed headlines and bomber crews earned medals, there was another group crawling through muddy trenches with heavy spools of wire on their backs. Field telephone layers might sound boring compared to dogfighting aces, but these guys faced some of the nastiest dangers of the war. Their job? Keep everyone connected when bullets started flying. Communication was everything in World War II. Without telephone lines connecting command posts to artillery units, tank crews and infantry positions, armies turned into confused mobs wandering around battlefields. Radio signals could be jammed or intercepted by the enemy. Carrier pigeons got shot down, but a good old-fashioned telephone wire, that was reliable. Problem was, someone had to string those wires across open battlefields while people were actively trying to kill them. The gear alone made these soldiers walking targets. Each telephone layer carried massive spools of heavy copper wire, NOS sometimes weighing 40 pounds or more. Try running for cover with that strapped to your back when machine guns open up. The wire spools were awkward, bulky, and caught on everything. Barbed wire, tree branches, bomb craters, you name it. Meanwhile, you're supposed to move fast enough to avoid getting shot. Then there's where they had to go. Artillery positions needed phone lines. Those positions were usually on hilltops or other exposed spots where you could see for miles. Great for shooting cannons, terrible for staying alive. Infantry units dug into forward positions needed connections too. That meant crawling through no man's land, often at night, unspooling wire behind you while hoping enemy snipers couldn't see your silhouette against the sky. The work itself was incredibly dangerous even without enemy fire. Telephone layers had to climb telephone poles, tall buildings, church steeples, anywhere they could get a clear line of sight and string wire above the chaos below. Snipers loved picking off guys stuck on poles 20 feet in the air. You're exposed, you can't move fast, and you're holding metal wire that catches the light. Might as well paint a target on your back. Weather made everything worse. Rain turned wire spools into slippery death traps. Mud made every step treacherous when you're carrying extra weight. Snow hid shell holes and wire obstacles. During winter battles, telephone layers worked with numb fingers trying to splice frozen copper wire while artillery shells exploded nearby. Ever tried to do delicate work with thick gloves on? Now imagine doing it while someone shoots at you. Enemy forces specifically targeted communication lines. German and Japanese troops knew that cutting phone wires could isolate entire units. They'd send out patrols specifically to hunt down telephone infrastructure. Some enemy snipers made a hobby of shooting at anything that looked like communication equipment. Telephone layers often found their carefully installed lines cut or destroyed within hours of putting them up. The psychological pressure was brutal. These soldiers worked mostly alone or in pairs, separated from larger units. When you're stringing wire between command posts, you're often in areas where nobody else wants to go. Dead zones between friendly positions, bombed out buildings that might collapse, areas where both sides had retreated, leaving behind mines and booby traps. Maintenance was just as deadly as installation. Phone lines got damaged constantly. Artillery shells, tank treads, bombing raids, enemy sabotage. Telephone layers had to go out during active battles to fix breaks in communication. Picture this: you're following a wire through a battlefield, looking for the spot where it got cut, while mortars are falling around you. Find the break, splice in new wire, test the connection, all while staying low enough to avoid sniper fire. The work was also incredibly precise. A bad connection could mean artillery firing on friendly positions instead of enemy ones. Crossed wires could send orders to the wrong units. Telephone layers carried testing equipment to make sure every connection worked perfectly, but that meant staying exposed longer at each connection point. Rush the job and people die from friendly fire. Take your time and you might get killed by enemy fire. Many telephone layers worked at night to avoid being spotted, but darkness brought new problems. You couldn't see shell holes, enemy patrols, or your own wire spools clearly. Tripping and falling while carrying heavy equipment made noise that attracted attention. Night vision was terrible, so you had to work mostly by feel, hoping you were connecting the right wires to the right terminals. The worst part: when telephone layers got killed or wounded, their equipment often got destroyed with them. Those heavy wire spools became useless scrap metal. Other soldiers had to risk their lives, retrieving the gear or bringing in replacements. Every lost telephone layer meant communication networks got weaker and less reliable. But there was another group of soldiers whose job was even more exposed than the wire layers. These men carried equipment that made them priority targets for every enemy sniper on the battlefield. While infantry soldiers crawled through trenches and bomber crews faced flak in the sky, there was another group of people keeping the entire war machine connected. Radio operators carried the lifeline that held armies together. Without them, generals couldn't give orders, pilots couldn't call for help, and tank crews would be driving blind into enemy territory. But here's the thing nobody talks about: radio operators had some of the shortest life expectancies on any battlefield. Why? Well, think about what made someone valuable to their own side. The same thing made them incredibly valuable targets for the enemy. A radio operator wasn't just another soldier with a rifle. He was the voice connecting scattered units across miles of battlefield. Kill the radio operator, and suddenly, an entire company goes silent. No calls for backup, no artillery support, no warning about incoming attacks. The equipment itself made them walking bullseyes. Early war radios weren't exactly pocket-sized. We're talking about devices that weighed 30 to 50 pounds, strapped to a soldier's back like an enormous metal backpack. The antenna stuck up several feet above their head. Snipers loved those antennas. They might as well have worn signs saying "shoot me first." Enemy spotters would scan battlefields specifically looking for those telltale radio antennas bobbing through the terrain. Then, there was the technical challenge that could get everyone killed. Radio operators had to maintain contact under the worst possible conditions. Shells exploding nearby could damage equipment or knock out signals entirely, but the operator still needed to keep talking, keep the connection alive, even when bullets were flying inches from his head. One study from the European theater showed that radio operators had a death rate nearly 3 times higher than regular infantry. 3 times. That's not a small difference, that's the difference between dangerous and nearly suicidal. The psychological pressure was brutal too. When your unit was pinned down by enemy fire, guess who everyone looked to for salvation? The radio operator. He was the one who had to call in airstrikes, request medical evacuation, or coordinate with other units for rescue. If the radio failed, if he couldn't make contact, people died. Not just him, his entire squad, maybe his entire company. The weight of that responsibility, combined with being the primary target, broke a lot of good soldiers. Enemy forces developed specific tactics for hunting radio operators. German snipers were trained to identify radio equipment and prioritize those targets. Japanese forces would monitor Allied radio frequencies, track the signals, then launch targeted attacks on the transmission source. Soviet forces used direction-finding equipment to locate German radio positions, then called in artillery strikes on those exact coordinates. Being a radio operator meant the enemy was actively hunting you with sophisticated equipment designed specifically to find and kill you. The work itself demanded incredible multitasking under deadly pressure. Radio operators had to encode and decode messages while staying alert for enemy movement. They needed to maintain their equipment, change frequencies to avoid enemy interception, and keep multiple communication channels open simultaneously, all while carrying that heavy radio equipment through combat zones, setting up antennas under fire, and trying not to get shot. Many operators worked 18-hour shifts because trained replacements were so hard to find. Radio security made their jobs even more dangerous. Operators couldn't just chat freely over the airwaves. Enemy forces were always listening. Messages had to be coded, which took extra time when seconds mattered. Codebooks had to be protected and regularly updated. If an operator was captured with current codes, it could compromise entire army communications networks. Some operators carried special thermite grenades specifically to destroy their radio equipment if capture seemed inevitable. The gear failures happened at the worst possible moments. Vacuum tubes would burn out during critical battles, wet weather would short-circuit connections, sand and dirt would jam controls. Battery power was always limited, especially during extended operations. Radio operators became expert field mechanics by necessity, rebuilding equipment under fire, jury-rigging repairs with whatever materials they could find. Sometimes they'd strip parts from damaged radios to keep one unit working. Different theaters presented unique radio challenges. In the Pacific, humidity corroded equipment faster than it could be replaced. Jungle terrain blocked signals, forcing operators to climb trees or scale cliffs to establish contact, perfect targets for enemy snipers. Arctic operations in Europe froze battery connections and made metal equipment too cold to handle with bare skin. Desert campaigns filled radio components with sand that acted like grinding paste on moving parts. The numbers tell the real story. Radio operators in frontline units had casualty rates approaching 60% in some campaigns. Units that lost their radio operators were twice as likely to suffer complete casualties compared to units that maintained communication throughout battles. The correlation was clear: keep your radio operator alive, and your chances of survival jumped dramatically. But here's what made it worse. Most radio operators were specially trained technicians who took weeks to replace. You couldn't just hand the radio to any soldier and hope for the best. When experienced operators died, their units often went without proper communications for days or weeks. Which brings us to another group whose technical skills made them priority targets. While everyone thinks about soldiers and sailors facing death in combat, there was another group racing toward danger every single night. City firefighters during the Blitz weren't just putting out ordinary house fires, they were running into infernos, while German bombers circled overhead, dropping more explosives on buildings that were already burning. London's fire brigade faced something no firefighter had ever dealt with before. One moment they'd be hosing down a burning shop. The next moment another wave of incendiary bombs would land 3 blocks away. The fires spread faster than they could contain them. These weren't small kitchen fires or chimney blazes. Entire city blocks turned into towering walls of flame that could be seen from miles away. The weird part, they had to keep working while the bombing continued. Air raid sirens would wail, anti-aircraft guns would thunder overhead, and chunks of burning debris would rain down around them. But the fires couldn't wait. Every minute they delayed meant more buildings lost, more people trapped, more of the city turning to ash. Then there were the gas mains. When bombs hit the streets, they didn't just damage buildings, they ruptured underground gas pipes, creating invisible death traps that could explode without warning. Firefighters would arrive at what looked like a normal structure fire, only to discover they were standing on top of a gas leak. One spark, one ember floating the wrong direction, and the entire street could go up in flames. But the real nightmare was the rescue work. These firefighters weren't just spraying water on flames. They were digging through collapsed buildings with their bare hands, following the sound of voices calling for help from underneath tons of rubble. They'd crawl into unstable structures that could collapse at any moment, following garden hoses through smoke so thick they couldn't see their own hands. The equipment they had was basic compared to what we'd expect today: heavy canvas hoses that took 3 men to carry, hand-operated pumps that needed constant manning, wooden ladders that could catch fire if they got too close to the flames. Most of their protective gear consisted of a metal helmet, and maybe a wet cloth over their mouth. That was it. Working conditions got even more dangerous when water mains were hit. No water pressure meant they had to pump directly from the Thames River, running miles of hose through bomb-damaged streets. Sometimes they'd set up their pumps only to have another wave of bombers target the fire trucks themselves. German pilots knew that hitting emergency vehicles would create even more chaos. The psychological pressure was enormous too. These men were watching their own city burn down around them. The buildings they were trying to save might be places where they'd shopped, worked, or visited friends. Sometimes they'd recognize faces in the rubble. Sometimes those faces belonged to people they knew. Night shifts lasted 12 hours or more, but the bombing didn't follow regular schedules. A firefighter might work all night, putting out blazes, then get called back out during the day, when delayed action bombs finally exploded. Some of these bombs were designed to go off hours, or even days after they landed, turning every fire scene into a potential time bomb. The death rate among London firefighters spiked dramatically during the heaviest bombing periods. They were killed by falling debris, building collapses, gas explosions, and direct hits from bombs. But they were also dying from smoke inhalation, exhaustion, and injuries sustained while crawling through wreckage in complete darkness. What made their job even more challenging was the blackout regulations. The entire city was supposed to stay dark to avoid giving German bombers easy targets. But massive fires created their own light, visible for miles. This meant firefighters were often working at ground zero of what would become the target for the next wave of bombing raids. Their families lived with constant worry too. Unlike soldiers who were shipped off to distant battlefields, these firefighters were risking their lives in their own neighborhoods. Their wives and children could often see the glow of the fires from their windows, knowing their husband or father was somewhere in the middle of that hell. The strangest part was how normal it became. After months of nightly bombing, responding to massive fires while Dodgers flew overhead just became part of the job. Firefighters developed dark humor about it, joking about which building would be next or whether they'd have time to finish their tea before the next alarm rang. These civilian heroes kept the city from burning to the ground, but their work didn't end when the bombing stopped. Unexploded ordnance remained buried throughout London for months after the war ended. But while firefighters battled blazes in bombed cities, another group was taking even bigger risks in the freezing waters around sinking ships. When ships went down in the middle of the ocean, somebody had to jump in after the survivors. That somebody was usually a rescue swimmer, and their job was about as dangerous as it sounds. These weren't your typical lifeguards at the local pool. They were diving into freezing, oil-slicked waters, while enemy planes might still be circling overhead. The water temperature in the North Atlantic rarely got above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, you had maybe 15 minutes before hypothermia started shutting down your body. But here's the thing. Rescue swimmers knew this, and jumped in anyway. They wore whatever protective gear they could find, which wasn't much. Most of the time, it was just a life vest and whatever clothing they had on. Picture this scenario. A torpedo hits an Allied merchant ship at 3 in the morning. The ship starts sinking fast. Sailors are jumping overboard into pitch-black water that's cold enough to kill them in minutes. The rescue ship arrives, but it can't get too close because debris and oil are everywhere. Someone has to go in after the survivors. That someone is strapping on a life vest and diving off the side of a perfectly good ship into what basically amounts to liquid death. The physical challenge was brutal enough on its own. Swimming in heavy seas, while trying to drag an unconscious person to safety, isn't exactly easy. Many survivors were injured, panicked, or so cold they couldn't help themselves. Some were covered in oil from their sinking ship, making them slippery and hard to grab. Others were in shock and fought against their rescuers, not understanding they were being saved. Then there were the environmental hazards. that made everything worse. Oil fires could spread across the water's surface, turning the rescue zone into a literal hell. Floating debris from destroyed ships created underwater obstacles that could trap or injure swimmers. Strong currents could sweep both rescuer and survivor away from the rescue vessel. And let's not forget about the sharks that were sometimes attracted to shipwreck sites. But the enemy didn't stop attacking just because there were people in the water. German U-boats had a nasty habit of sticking around after torpedoing a ship, sometimes firing on lifeboats or rescue vessels. Japanese planes would strafe survivors floating in life rafts. Rescue swimmers had to work knowing that at any moment, machine gun fire could start ripping through the water around them. The equipment available to these swimmers was primitive by today's standards. No insulated wetsuits, no modern rescue devices, no GPS to help locate survivors in the dark. They had rope, maybe a life ring, and their own 2 arms. Communication with the rescue ship was done by hand signals or shouting, not easy when you're fighting waves and trying to keep someone's head above water. Speed was everything in these rescues. The longer someone stayed in freezing water, the lower their chances of survival became. Rescue swimmers had to make quick decisions about who to save first and how to get multiple survivors back to safety. Sometimes they had to make the horrible choice of leaving someone who was clearly dying to save others who still had a chance. Many rescue swimmers developed their own techniques through trial and error. Some learned to approach panicked survivors from behind, to avoid being grabbed and dragged under. Others figured out how to use floating debris as temporary rest points during long rescues. The smart ones always kept one eye on the rescue ship to make sure they weren't drifting too far away. The psychological toll was enormous. These men watched people die in their arms despite their best efforts. They pulled bodies out of the water that had been floating for days. They had to keep working while listening to the screams and cries of survivors they couldn't reach in time. Many rescue swimmers suffered from what we'd now call PTSD, though nobody had a name for it back then. Weather conditions made everything exponentially more dangerous. Storms could turn a difficult rescue into an impossible one. High waves made it hard to spot survivors, and even harder to swim to them. Rain and snow reduced visibility to almost nothing. Ice formations in northern waters could cut swimmers or trap them under floating chunks. Despite all these dangers, rescue swimmers saved thousands of lives during the war. They worked in every theater of combat, from the Pacific to the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. Some were official Navy rescue specialists. Others were just sailors who volunteered when someone needed to go overboard. Their casualty rates were significant, but they kept jumping in because they knew that every minute counted when someone was drowning. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. These men risked their lives in the water to save people whose ships had been sunk by an enemy that was probably still nearby. But while rescue swimmers fought against time and temperature to pull survivors from the sea, other dangerous jobs involved moving the very weapons that caused these shipwrecks in the first place. Picture being handed the keys to a truck loaded with enough explosives to level a city block. Now imagine driving that death trap through enemy territory where snipers wait behind every tree and mines hide under every pothole. Welcome to life as an ammunition transporter during World War II. These weren't your typical delivery drivers. They hauled artillery shells, mortar rounds, grenades and enough TNT to make the 4th of July look like a birthday candle. One direct hit from enemy fire, the resulting explosion would vaporize the truck, the driver, and anything unlucky enough to be within a quarter-mile radius. Makes your daily commute seem pretty tame, right? The math was brutal. Frontline troops burned through ammunition faster than Hollywood burns through sequels. A single artillery battery could fire hundreds of shells in one engagement. Machine gun units went through thousands of rounds per day. Someone had to keep these hungry weapons fed, and that someone usually drove an unarmored truck packed with enough firepower to sink a battleship. Most ammunition transporters drove regular commercial trucks with thin metal sides. Armor plating, that was reserved for tanks and important people. These drivers got canvas covers and a prayer. The military figured speed mattered more than protection. Fat lot of good speed does when you're hauling 3 tons of high explosives up a mountain road. Enemy forces knew exactly what these trucks carried. German pilots specifically hunted ammunition convoys. One Stuka dive bomber could turn an entire supply column into a fireworks display that would be visible for miles. Japanese forces in the Pacific developed similar tactics, targeting ammo trucks during their vulnerable supply runs through jungle roads. Then there were the roads themselves. Engineers tried their best, but wartime roads were disasters waiting to happen. Potholes deep enough to swallow a jeep. Bridges held together with hope and prayer. mountain passes where one wrong turn meant a 1,000-foot drop. Now imagine navigating these obstacles while enemy artillery zeroes in on your position. The loading process alone could kill you. Ammunition handlers worked frantically to pack trucks before enemy bombers arrived. Artillery shells weighed anywhere from 20 to 200 pounds each. Drop one the wrong way. Goodbye. Loading dock. The handlers developed a dark sense of humor about their work. They called themselves boom boys and joked that they had the most explosive job in the military. But the real terror started once you hit the road. Ammunition convoys followed specific routes, often the same ones used day after day. Enemy forces mapped these patterns. They planted mines at choke points, set up ambushes at river crossings, posted snipers along hillsides overlooking the roads. Every mile presented a new opportunity for catastrophic failure. Radio communication added another layer of danger. Drivers needed to stay in contact with base, but enemy forces monitored radio frequencies. Too much chatter and you'd broadcast your exact location to every hostile unit in the area. Too little communication and friendly forces might mistake you for an enemy convoy. Several ammunition trucks were destroyed by their own side's artillery. Weather made everything worse. Rain turned dirt roads into impassable mud traps. Snow concealed mines and made vehicle control nearly impossible. Desert heat could cook off unstable explosives before you reached your destination. Humidity in tropical climates corroded fuses and made ammunition unpredictably dangerous to handle. The psychological pressure was enormous. Every bump in the road could trigger an explosion. Every engine knock might be your last sound. Drivers developed superstitions and rituals. Some refused to carry certain types of ammunition. Others insisted on specific routes or lucky charms. Anything to feel like they had some control over their fate. Unloading presented its own hazards. Frontline troops wanted their ammunition fast, but rushing the process invited accidents. Damaged shells could explode during handling. Incorrectly stored ammunition might detonate hours later when friendly forces least expected it. Many ammunition transporters died, not from enemy action, but from accidents during supposedly routine deliveries. Some drivers made dozens of successful runs before their luck ran out. Others didn't survive their first trip. Experience helped, but not much. Even veteran drivers could hit an unmarked mine, or catch a random artillery shell. The job had a brutal equality. Skill and caution improved your odds, but couldn't guarantee survival. The strangest part, many ammunition transporters were volunteers. They knew the risks, understood the mortality rates, but signed up anyway. Some did it for extra pay. Others believed deeply in their cause. A few just wanted the adrenaline rush that comes from literally sitting on top of a mobile bomb. Despite everything working against them, these drivers kept the war machine running. Without ammunition, the most advanced weapons became expensive paperweights. Every successful delivery meant friendly forces could hold their positions, launch attacks, or defend against enemy advances. Speaking of defending positions, some soldiers found themselves in situations where retreat wasn't an option and escape seemed impossible. Prison camps scattered across occupied territory held thousands of Allied personnel, but not everyone accepted captivity quietly. Breaking out required different skills entirely. Getting captured as a prisoner of war was supposed to mean safety under the Geneva Convention. Right? Well, tell that to the thousands of POWs who decided their best chance of survival was breaking out of heavily guarded camps surrounded by enemy territory. These weren't Hollywood heroes with perfect escape plans. Most were desperate men who knew that staying put might mean slow death from starvation, disease, or worse. The numbers tell the real story. Out of roughly 316,000 Allied prisoners held in German camps, only about 35,000 attempted escape. Of those brave enough to try, fewer than 1,000 made it back to Allied lines. The rest, shot while running, recaptured and punished, or lost in hostile countryside where every civilian could turn them in for a reward. But here's what made prison camp escapes so incredibly dangerous. You weren't just fighting guards and barbed wire, you were fighting geography, language barriers, hunger, and an entire nation trained to spot foreigners. British Flight Lieutenant Jimmy James escaped from camps 8 different times. 8. Each attempt meant risking execution, because by 1944, Hitler had issued his commando order: captured escapees could be shot on sight rather than returned to prison. The Great Escape from Stalag Luft 3 shows just how deadly these attempts became. 76 men crawled through Harry, a tunnel dug 30 feet underground and stretching 348 feet beyond the camp fence. The digging alone took nearly a year, with prisoners using makeshift tools and disposing of tons of sandy soil by hiding it in their pockets during daily walks. 3 men made it back to Britain, 50 were executed by the Gestapo, the rest spent months in solitary confinement. Then there were the technical challenges that could kill you before guards even noticed you were missing. Tunnels collapsed regularly, burying diggers alive in German sand. Prisoners had to engineer ventilation systems using stolen tins and fabric bellows operated by hand. One wrong calculation, and you'd suffocate 20 feet underground while your friends kept digging above you. Creating fake documents was another deadly skill prisoners had to master. Getting caught with forged papers meant immediate execution as a spy rather than treatment as a POW. Yet without proper identification, travel papers, and work permits, escapees had zero chance of moving through Nazi Germany. Prisoners became expert forgers, using everything from beet juice for ink to carved soap for rubber stamps. Makes you appreciate modern photocopiers, doesn't it? Weather added another layer of danger that Hollywood rarely mentions. Escape attempts usually happened in winter when longer nights provided more darkness to cover movement. But winter in Eastern Europe meant temperatures dropping to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Escapees wore stolen or improvised civilian clothes that offered little protection against freezing winds. Many died from exposure within miles of the camp, found frozen in forests or abandoned buildings. Language barriers turned every human encounter into a potential death sentence. A single mispronounced word or unfamiliar accent could expose an escaper to suspicious civilians. Some prisoners spent months learning German phrases and studying regional dialects. Others posed as foreign workers. There were millions of them in wartime Germany, hoping their broken German would seem natural. The most dangerous part: even successful escapees weren't safe. They had to cross hundreds of miles of occupied territory, avoid military checkpoints, and somehow reach neutral countries or allied lines that kept moving as the war progressed. Many escapees got within miles of freedom, only to be captured by regular army units, who had no idea they were dealing with POWs rather than spies or saboteurs. Soviet prisoners faced even worse odds. German camps holding Russian POWs had execution rates that made other camps look merciful. Attempted escape often meant death for the escaper, plus 10 random prisoners shot in retaliation. Still, desperate men kept trying because staying meant slow starvation anyway. Some escape attempts succeeded through pure audacity, rather than careful planning. RAF pilot Aidan Crawley walked out of his Italian camp wearing a fake German uniform made from dyed British battle dress. He traveled by train for 3 days, chatting with German soldiers, before reaching Allied lines in southern Italy. His biggest challenge wasn't avoiding capture, it was convincing British troops he wasn't actually a German trying to infiltrate their positions. The psychological pressure of planning escapes was almost as dangerous as the attempts themselves. Prisoners spent months or years preparing, knowing that one informant or guard's suspicion could mean death for entire escape committees. Some men cracked under the pressure and confessed their plans. Others became paranoid about fellow prisoners, never knowing who might trade escape information for better treatment. But the most chilling aspect of prison camp escapes was how guards used them as entertainment and target practice. Some camps deliberately made certain escape routes seem possible, while setting up killing zones where guards could shoot fleeing prisoners legally, under camp regulations. Yet even with these impossible odds, desperate prisoners kept trying to break free, because sometimes the most dangerous choice was also the only choice that offered hope. Speaking of impossible odds, there were sailors facing their own version of frozen hell on the Arctic convoy routes, where enemy submarines lurked beneath ice floes and storms could sink ships faster than torpedoes. When most people think of dangerous wartime sailing, they picture tropical battles in the Pacific or submarine hunts in the Atlantic. Well, forget everything you know about naval warfare. The Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union were something else entirely, a frozen nightmare where the weather could kill you faster than the enemy. The Arctic Ocean during World War II wasn't just cold, it was apocalyptically, bone-crushingly, mind-numbingly frozen. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero, waves froze solid on deck within seconds. And here's the kicker, Allied sailors had to navigate through this icy hell while dodging German bombers, submarines and surface ships. Talk about multitasking under pressure. These convoys carried vital supplies to keep the Soviet Union fighting. Without them, Stalin's forces would have collapsed. Food, ammunition, tanks, aircraft, everything the Red Army needed traveled this route. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and everyone knew it. But knowing something matters and actually surviving it. Two very different things. Let's talk about what Arctic conditions actually meant for these sailors. Your spit would freeze before it hit the deck. Metal tools stuck to bare skin instantly, tearing flesh when pulled away. Men had to break ice off their eyebrows just to see properly. The lucky ones got frostbite in their fingers and toes. The unlucky ones, they didn't make it home with all their limbs attached. Then there's the darkness issue. During winter months, the sun basically gave up and went on vacation for weeks at a time. Complete darkness, 24 hours a day. Navigation became a guessing game played with deadly stakes. Ships crashed into icebergs they never saw coming. Crews lost track of other vessels in their own convoy. And the weird part is, this darkness that made everything harder also became their best friend when enemy planes showed up. German forces knew exactly how valuable these convoys were. They threw everything they had at them. Luftwaffe bombers flew constant missions, hunting for Allied ships. U-boats lurked beneath the ice, waiting for perfect torpedo shots. Surface raiders like the Tirpitz threatened to break out and destroy entire convoys. The Germans called it Operation Russellsprung, Knight's Move. Chess metaphors aside, they wanted these supply lines cut permanently. But here's where it gets really nasty. When ships got hit in the Arctic, survival times in the water measured in minutes, not hours. The cold would kill you before you could even think about drowning. Life rafts became death traps when spray froze solid on contact. Rescue operations turned into races against hypothermia, and hypothermia usually won. Convoy PQ-17 became the perfect example of how wrong things could go. 35 merchant ships left Iceland in July 1942. Only 11 made it to Soviet ports. The Admiralty, fearing an attack by German surface ships, ordered the convoy to scatter. Bad move. Without naval protection, the Germans picked off individual ships like sitting ducks. Hundreds of sailors died in freezing water, watching their supplies sink to the ocean floor. The sailors who survived these runs developed their own survival techniques. They learned to work in pairs, watching each other for signs of frostbite or hypothermia. Smart crews rigged heating systems in critical areas, though fuel was always precious. Some ships carried special Arctic gear, but most made do with whatever they could find. Layering became an art form, and everyone became an expert on preventing ice buildup. Navigation in these conditions required serious skill, and even more luck. Compasses went haywire near the magnetic North Pole. Radio communications got scrambled by atmospheric interference. Dead reckoning became literal. Make a mistake, and you're dead. Experienced Arctic navigators became worth their weight in gold, assuming you could keep them alive long enough to use their expertise. The psychological pressure was just as brutal as the physical conditions. Months of darkness, constant cold, and the knowledge that enemy forces were hunting you created a special kind of stress. Shell shock wasn't just for infantry. Sailors on these runs developed their own version of combat fatigue. Some crews reported hallucinations from the isolation and darkness. Others couldn't sleep, knowing how quickly things could go wrong. Supply statistics tell the real story. Over 4 years, these convoys delivered millions of tons of equipment to the Soviet Union. Aircraft, tanks, food, raw materials, stuff that kept the Eastern Front alive. But the cost was enormous. Dozens of merchant ships went down. Hundreds of sailors died in the frozen water. Naval escorts got sunk protecting convoys they couldn't always save. Soviet ports weren't exactly safe havens either. Murmansk and Archangel got bombed regularly. German aircraft attacked ships even while they were unloading. Sailors who survived weeks in Arctic conditions could get killed in port by bombing raids. The danger never really stopped, it just changed location. These Arctic convoy veterans rarely talked about their experiences after the war. Most people couldn't understand what they'd been through. Fighting ice, darkness and enemy forces simultaneously created memories that were hard to share. But their contribution was massive. They kept an entire front of the war supplied when it mattered most. Speaking of dangerous jobs that went unrecognized, night bombing missions created their own special category of terror. When most people think of World War II bombing missions, they picture formations of B-17s flying through daylight skies, taking heavy fire from German fighters. That's the Hollywood version. The reality: some of the deadliest bombing runs happened when the sun went down and visibility dropped to almost zero. Night bombing wasn't just dangerous, it was practically suicide with wings attached. Pilots flew without proper instruments, navigated by starlight, and hoped their engines wouldn't give out over enemy territory. No radar guidance, no fancy electronics, just a compass, maybe a map, and a prayer that you'd find your target before enemy fighters found you. The most famous night bombers weren't even flying the big heavy aircraft you'd expect. They were Soviet women pilots flying rickety biplanes that looked like they belonged in a museum, not a war zone. The Germans called them Nachthexen, night witches. These pilots flew ancient Polikarpov Po-2 training planes made mostly of canvas and wood, in a war with machine guns and anti-aircraft fire. Here's the crazy part about these planes. They were so slow and flew so low that German fighter planes couldn't match their speed without stalling out. Messerschmitts were built for high-speed combat, not puttering around at 80 miles per hour just above treetop level. German pilots would overshoot their targets and have to circle back, giving the night witches precious seconds to complete their bombing runs and disappear into the darkness. But flying slow in a canvas plane had its own problems. The aircraft offered zero protection from small arms fire. A single rifle bullet could punch through the fuselage, the wings or the pilot. These women flew missions with no parachutes because the planes were too small and flew too low for parachutes to work anyway. If something went wrong, you rode the plane all the way down. The night witches developed tactics that would make special forces jealous. They'd approach targets with their engines turned off, gliding silently through the night sky. The only sound enemy soldiers heard was a faint whooshing, like wind through fabric right before bombs started falling. By the time German troops figured out where the attack was coming from, the planes had already dropped their payload and vanished back into the darkness. Nadezhda Popova, one of the most decorated night witches, flew 852 combat missions. That's not a typo. 852 times she climbed into a flimsy biplane and flew into enemy territory at night. She once landed with 42 bullet holes in her aircraft, and calmly counted them before her next mission. Her plane's fabric skin was patched and repatched so many times it looked like a quilt. Navigation presented its own nightmare. No GPS, obviously, no radio beacons. These pilots used rivers, roads and distinctive buildings as landmarks, except cities were often blacked out or bombed beyond recognition. Flying at night meant following railway lines, or hoping the moon would peek through cloud cover long enough to spot a familiar landmark. Getting lost over enemy territory in a slow, defenseless plane was essentially a death sentence. Then there were the British night bomber crews flying much larger aircraft over German industrial targets. RAF Bomber Command sent thousands of men on nighttime raids over heavily defended cities. These crews faced different but equally deadly challenges. German night fighters equipped with radar hunted Allied bombers in the darkness, and Luftwaffe pilots became incredibly skilled at finding and destroying aircraft that thought darkness would protect them. The psychological pressure was enormous. Daytime bombing at least let you see threats coming, enemy fighters approaching, flak bursts getting closer, damage to your own aircraft. Night bombing meant flying blind through walls of anti-aircraft fire, never knowing if the next burst would tear your plane apart. Crews reported the eerie experience of seeing tracer rounds streak past their windows while hearing the distant rumble of explosions, unable to tell if they were hitting their targets or missing completely. German defenses adapted quickly to night bombing tactics. They positioned searchlight batteries in coordination with anti-aircraft guns, creating illuminated kill zones where bombers became sitting ducks. Once caught in a searchlight beam, aircraft were visible to every gun in the area. Pilots would throw their planes into violent evasive maneuvers, diving and climbing desperately to escape the lights while trying not to crash into other aircraft in their formation. Weather added another layer of danger that daylight missions rarely faced. Night flights meant navigating through cloud cover without visual references, dealing with ice formation on wings and windscreens, and fighting crosswinds during landing approaches at darkened airfields. Many night bomber crews survived their missions only to crash during landing because they couldn't see the runway properly. The mathematics of night bombing were grim. Lower visibility meant reduced accuracy, which meant more missions were required to destroy the same targets. More missions meant more exposure to danger, and the statistics caught up with everyone eventually. While day bombing grabbed headlines, these night missions carved out their own deadly corner of the war. But the risks in the sky were just one part of a much larger picture of battlefield medicine happening simultaneously on the ground. While fighter pilots got the glory and bomber crews grabbed headlines, there were women working just yards from exploding shells who rarely made the newspapers. Battlefield nurses didn't just patch up soldiers in safe hospitals miles behind the lines. They crawled through mud, slept in bombed-out buildings, and performed surgery while artillery shells whistled overhead. The math alone tells you how dangerous their job was. During the Battle of Anzio, nurses at evacuation hospitals had a higher casualty rate than some infantry units. Why? Because wounded soldiers got moved to safety as quickly as possible. Nurses stayed put, treating wave after wave of casualties right where the fighting was fiercest. Take the field hospitals in Normandy after D-Day. These weren't the clean white hospitals you see in movies. They were canvas tents pitched in muddy fields, sometimes less than a mile from active combat zones. German artillery could reach them easily, and often did. Nurses worked 16-hour shifts while listening to incoming rounds get closer and closer. But here's what made their job uniquely terrifying. They couldn't fight back. A bomber gunner could at least shoot at enemy fighters. An infantryman carried a rifle. Nurses had bandages and morphine. When German planes strafed their hospitals, all they could do was throw themselves over their patients and hope the Red Cross markings actually meant something to the pilots above. The shortages made everything worse. Military planners always underestimated how much medical supplies would be needed. Nurses routinely operated with equipment that belonged in museums, not operating rooms. They sterilized instruments with whatever they could find, reused bandages until they fell apart, and rationed morphine so strictly that soldiers with missing limbs got aspirin instead. Then there was the psychological toll nobody talks about. These women treated boys who were barely old enough to shave, watching them die from wounds that would be easily treatable today. Shell shock cases were particularly hard to handle. Imagine trying to calm down a soldier having a breakdown while bombs are falling around your own tent. Disease outbreaks added another layer of danger. Cramped conditions, poor sanitation, and exhausted immune systems created perfect breeding grounds for illness. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia killed nurses almost as often as enemy action did. The weird part, many nurses were more afraid of getting sick than getting bombed. At least you could hear artillery coming. Soviet nurses faced some of the worst conditions imaginable. They often worked without anesthesia, performing amputations with patients fully conscious. Some carried wounded soldiers on their backs for miles through active battlefields. The Eastern Front was so brutal that nurses routinely worked in buildings that were still being contested by both sides. Pacific theater nurses dealt with unique horrors. The heat and humidity made everything worse. From infected wounds to equipment failures, they treated burns from flamethrowers, injuries from bamboo spears, and tropical diseases they'd never seen before. Some island battles were so intense that nurses worked in underground bunkers, never seeing daylight for weeks. The Japanese didn't recognize the Red Cross symbol, which meant nurses were legitimate targets. Several hospital ships were deliberately attacked, and field hospitals got shelled regardless of their markings. Makes sense from a military standpoint, even if it violated international law. Healthy enemies are more dangerous than wounded ones. Many nurses volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. Flight nurses evacuated wounded soldiers in planes that were barely airworthy. Often while under attack, they'd land on improvised airstrips under fire, load up casualties, and take off through flak and fighter attacks. These women had casualty rates that rivaled bomber crews. What's remarkable is how young many of these nurses were. Fresh out of nursing school, they went straight from learning basic medical procedures to performing battlefield surgery under combat conditions. No amount of training could prepare them for treating wounds caused by modern weapons while under attack themselves. The equipment they worked with would shock you. Operating tables made from doors balanced on sawhorses, surgical lights powered by truck batteries, sterilization done with boiling water in mess hall pots. Yet somehow they managed to save lives that doctors in proper hospitals might have given up on. Communication was another constant problem. Radio equipment often failed, which meant nurses had no way to call for supplies, reinforcements, or evacuation when things went bad. They learned to make life or death medical decisions in complete isolation, never knowing if help was coming. Sleep deprivation made everything more dangerous. During major offensives, nurses worked for days straight without rest. Exhausted people make mistakes, and in battlefield medicine, mistakes kill patients. Yet they kept going because stopping meant watching soldiers die who might have been saved. The courage of these women becomes even more impressive when you consider what happened when hospitals got overrun. Unlike combat troops who could retreat or surrender, nurses often stayed with patients who couldn't be moved. Some were captured, some were killed, but most just kept working until the very end. While nurses saved lives under impossible conditions, another group of people worked in windowless rooms where a single mistake could doom entire fleets to destruction. While nurses and soldiers battled death on the front lines, another war raged in quiet rooms filled with typewriters and cigarette smoke. The code breakers fought with pencils instead of bullets, but one wrong calculation could sink an entire fleet. These unsung heroes worked in shadows, cracking enemy secrets that determined whether thousands lived or died. Their battlefield, endless streams of seemingly random letters and numbers that held the keys to victory. Breaking enemy codes wasn't just about being smart. Sure, you needed brains, but you also needed nerves of steel. Every decoded message carried weight that could crush you if you thought about it too long. Imagine discovering that enemy submarines were heading toward a convoy of supply ships carrying medicine for wounded soldiers. Get the math wrong, miss a crucial detail, and those ships disappear beneath the waves. No pressure, right? The work itself was mind-numbing and intense at the same time. Codebreakers sat hunched over desks for 12 to 16 hours straight, surrounded by towers of intercepted enemy transmissions. Each message looked like gibberish, random letters scattered across pages with no apparent meaning. But hidden in that chaos were battle plans, troop movements, and attack schedules. Finding patterns in what appeared to be randomness required a special kind of genius, mixed with stubborn determination. Bletchley Park in England became the epicenter of Allied code-breaking operations. Thousands of people worked there, many of them brilliant women who'd been recruited from universities across Britain. They called themselves the girls who listened to Hitler's secrets, though their work went far beyond just German communications. Japanese naval codes, Italian diplomatic messages, and even communications from neutral countries found their way onto their desks. The famous Enigma machine posed the biggest challenge. German operators used these typewriter-like devices to scramble messages using millions of possible combinations. Each day brought new settings, new rotor positions, and new headaches for the codebreakers trying to crack them. The machine looked innocent enough, now but the size of a portable typewriter, but it represented one of the most sophisticated encryption systems ever created. Breaking Enigma required more than human intelligence. British codebreakers developed some of the world's first computers, massive mechanical beasts called bombers that could test thousands of possible combinations per hour. These machines filled entire rooms and made enough noise to wake the dead, but they could accomplish in hours what would take human calculators weeks to complete. Then there were the Japanese codes. While everyone focused on Enigma, American codebreakers in the Pacific faced their own nightmare scenarios. Japanese naval codes used different principles entirely, relying on complex substitution systems that changed regularly. The famous magic intercepts revealed Japanese diplomatic intentions, but naval codes proved much tougher nuts to crack. The pressure was relentless because time always worked against the codebreakers. Enemy forces didn't wait for convenient decoding schedules. A message intercepted at midnight might reveal an attack planned for dawn. Missing the deadline meant missing the chance to save lives. Codebreakers learned to work under crushing time pressure, knowing that every minute they spent puzzling over a particularly difficult cipher could cost soldiers their lives. Secrecy added another layer of psychological stress. These people knew secrets that could change the course of battles, but they couldn't tell anyone. Not their families, not their friends, not even other military personnel. They watched news reports about battles they'd helped win through their intelligence work, but they had to pretend they were just as surprised as everyone else. Many carried these secrets for decades after the war ended. The work took a physical toll too. Eye strain from staring at coded messages for hours caused headaches and vision problems. The constant mental strain led to nervous breakdowns and exhaustion. Some codebreakers developed obsessive behaviors, seeing patterns in everyday things like wallpaper or newspaper headlines. The line between brilliant insight and paranoid delusion sometimes got uncomfortably thin, but when they succeeded, the results were spectacular. Decoded German messages revealed U-boat positions, allowing Allied ships to avoid submarine wolf packs. Cracked Japanese communications provided advance warning of major naval operations. Intelligence gathered through code-breaking efforts shortened the war by an estimated 2 years and saved countless lives. The strangest part was how ordinary many of these codebreakers looked. Librarians, teachers, chess players, and crossword puzzle enthusiasts found themselves wielding influence over global events. A quiet mathematician might decode a message that prevented an invasion. A former school teacher could crack a cipher that saved an entire convoy from submarine attacks. Their success created an interesting problem. The better they got at their jobs, the more dangerous their work became. As Allied intelligence improved, enemy forces grew suspicious about how their plans kept getting discovered. Counterintelligence operations targeted code-breaking facilities, making these quiet rooms filled with mathematicians potential military targets. While these secret warriors fought their invisible battles with enemy communications, another group of unsung heroes risked their lives carrying messages through war zones where radios couldn't reach. While most war jobs required specialized training or military service, one of the most dangerous roles fell to ordinary people who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Civilian couriers weren't soldiers, spies, or resistance fighters by choice. They were shopkeepers, teachers, farmers, and teenagers who found themselves carrying messages that could change the course of battles. The job sounds simple enough. Pick up a message here, deliver it there. But when they're meant crossing enemy lines with information that could get entire units killed if intercepted, simple became deadly fast. These weren't professional agents with fancy gadgets or escape plans. Most civilian couriers had nothing but their wits and whatever story they could come up with if stopped by patrols. What made civilian couriers so valuable was exactly what made them so vulnerable. They looked harmless. A grandmother with a basket of vegetables could walk through checkpoints that would stop a uniformed soldier immediately. A kid on a bicycle delivering bread seemed innocent enough. Enemy forces knew this, which meant they got suspicious of everyone. The French resistance relied heavily on civilian couriers during the German occupation. Housewives would hide coded messages in their shopping bags, walking casually through Paris while carrying intelligence about German troop movements. One wrong look, one nervous gesture, and they'd find themselves facing interrogation that rarely ended well. Then there were the children. Seems harsh to think about, but kids made excellent couriers precisely because adults didn't take them seriously. A 12-year-old could slip through spaces adults couldn't reach and move around without drawing much attention. The downside, if caught, enemy forces showed little mercy regardless of age. In occupied territories across Europe, ordinary people found themselves running messages between resistance cells scattered across countryside and cities. They'd memorize routes through forests, navigate bombed-out streets, and cross rivers at night, all while carrying information that could save lives or doom entire operations. The gear was deliberately basic. No fancy radio equipment or military-grade anything that would give them away if searched. Messages got sewn into clothing, hidden in false compartments of everyday items, or sometimes just memorized completely. A courier might spend days walking with crucial battle plans tucked inside a loaf of bread. Weather added another layer of danger. Winter meant leaving tracks in snow that patrols could follow. Rain turned dirt roads into mud traps that slowed escape routes. Summer heat made long walks exhausting, and tired people made mistakes that got them caught. But here's the thing about civilian couriers that made their job especially terrifying. They had no backup. Professional soldiers traveled in units, spies had extraction plans, but civilian couriers were completely on their own. Miss a checkpoint, take a wrong turn, or run into an unexpected patrol, and there was nobody coming to help. The punishment for getting caught wasn't just death. Enemy forces would torture captured couriers for information about who sent them, where they were going, and what other operations might be planned. A single captured courier could unravel weeks of careful planning and get dozens of other people killed. Different theaters of war used civilian couriers in different ways. In the Pacific, islanders would carry messages between Allied forces and local resistance groups, navigating through jungles while avoiding Japanese patrols. In Eastern Europe, farmers would transport intelligence across frozen fields, risking both enemy bullets and death by exposure. Some of the most dangerous courier runs happened in cities during active bombardment. London during the Blitz, Stalingrad during the siege, Berlin as Allied forces closed in. Couriers had to navigate through rubble-filled streets while bombs fell around them, carrying messages between commanders who desperately needed updated information about enemy positions. The psychological pressure was enormous. Professional soldiers trained for combat stress, but civilian couriers were just regular people thrust into life-or-death situations they never expected to face. Many developed what we'd now recognize as severe anxiety, jumping at every sound and seeing threats everywhere. Success rates varied wildly, depending on location and timing. Some courier networks operated for months without losing anyone. Others saw people captured or killed weekly. The truly heartbreaking part was that many civilian couriers volunteered knowing the odds weren't good, because they believed the information they carried could help end the war sooner. What's remarkable is how many ordinary people stepped up when asked to risk everything for strangers they'd never meet. A message about enemy tank positions might save a platoon of soldiers fighting 50 miles away. Intelligence about supply routes could help plan attacks that shortened the war by days or weeks. These weren't heroes seeking glory or recognition. Most civilian couriers never got medals or even acknowledgement for their service. They just did what needed doing when the situation demanded it. And speaking of people doing dangerous work without recognition, there's one group whose contribution to ending the war was so secret that most people didn't learn about it until decades later. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, something strange happened. The world celebrated, but millions of people who had risked everything suddenly found themselves invisible. Not literally invisible, but their stories, their near-death experiences, the incredible dangers they faced daily. Nobody wanted to talk about it anymore. Everyone was tired of war. Fair enough. But here's what's wild. Many of the most dangerous jobs we've talked about stayed secret for decades. Those codebreakers who saved entire fleets. They couldn't breathe a word about their work until the 1970s. The spies who parachuted behind enemy lines. Most took their stories to the grave because nobody asked. Take the merchant mariners. These guys had one of the deadliest jobs in the entire war. Higher casualty rates than many combat units. Yet for years they weren't even considered veterans. No benefits, no recognition, no thank you for almost dying multiple times. Why? Because technically they were civilians. Bureaucracy at its finest, right? The Soviet Union was particularly brutal about erasing dangerous jobs from history. Those penal battalions we mentioned. The soldiers forced into suicide missions. Moscow pretended they never existed. Can't have stories about using your own people as human shields when you're trying to look like the good guys. Many survivors were told to keep quiet or face more punishment. Then there were the women. Female pilots, nurses, resistance fighters, factory workers handling explosives. Their contributions got buried under decades of war was a man's job nonsense. The night witches, those Soviet female pilots who terrified the Germans, weren't properly honored until the 1980s. 40 years later, some of them were still alive, wondering if anyone remembered what they'd done. But the weirdest part, many of these risk-takers didn't want to talk either. Survivor's guilt hit hard. When your entire bomber crew died except you, celebrating your survival felt wrong. When you made it through Normandy, while your buddy didn't, sharing war stories at the local bar seemed inappropriate. So they stayed quiet, went back to normal jobs, and tried to forget. Here's something that'll surprise you. Some of the most dangerous wartime jobs continued after the war ended. Minesweepers kept working for years, clearing millions of mines from European waters and coastlines. One wrong move still meant instant death, but now it was peacetime, so nobody paid attention. These guys were still dying in 1947, 1948, clearing up the mess everyone else wanted to forget about. The psychological toll was enormous too. Today we know about PTSD, but back then, shell shock was seen as weakness. Ball turret gunners who spent years cramped in those death traps, watching friends get shot down, were told to snap out of it and get back to normal life. Tank crews who survived being trapped in burning steel coffins were handed discharge papers and a pat on the back. Good luck readjusting. What's really striking is how ordinary these people were before the war. Farmers became paratroopers. Shop clerks became radio operators running through battlefields. Teenagers became submarine crew members, trapped underwater for months. Bank tellers became resistance couriers, carrying secrets that could get them tortured. The war didn't choose heroes, it made them. And here's the thing about survival. It often came down to pure luck. The best trained pilot could get shot down on his first mission, while some kid who barely knew how to fly made it through 50 bombing runs. The most experienced sapper could step on a mine, while a nervous replacement cleared an entire field without incident. Skill mattered, but luck mattered more. Many families never knew how dangerous their loved one's job really was. Letters home were censored, and most people downplayed the risks to avoid worrying their families. Just doing my part, they'd write, while dodging bullets or defusing bombs or flying through flak fields. The full truth usually came out decades later, if at all. The physical scars were obvious, missing limbs, burn marks, shrapnel wounds, but the mental scars stayed hidden. How do you explain to your wife that every time a car backfires you hit the ground expecting artillery? How do you tell your kids that crowded rooms make you panic because you remember being trapped in a sinking ship? Recognition came slowly, sometimes too slowly. By the time government started acknowledging these forgotten heroes, many had already died. Medals were awarded to empty chairs. Speeches were given to half-empty rooms. The people who had risked everything were finally getting their due, but time had already taken too many of them. Every single dangerous job we've covered was filled by someone's father, brother, son, daughter, mother, or sister. They weren't superhuman. They were just regular people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and somehow kept going. Their courage wasn't the Hollywood kind. It was the quiet, grinding determination to do their job, even when that job could kill them. And somehow, against impossible odds, enough of them survived to win the war and build the world we live in today.